whatever is fine. Musical chairs later. We got Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Christopher Sands, and I'm professor and director of the Center for Canadian Studies here at Johns Hopkins University's NITSA School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, as is affectionately known, far and wide. I'm really pleased today to be able to have a terrific panel. I said to them when we were organizing it, I was really hoping to avoid a worthwhile initiative from Canada as the billing for this, but Canada is actually doing some very worthwhile things, interesting things, addressing the digital economy and its threats and challenges for both regulators trying to regulate the space, citizens, but most importantly in their current context, elections, because Canada, as many of you will know, has an election coming up on the 21st of October. I'll put in a small plug, if you don't mind, but in conjunction with Politico, which is providing us with some of our sponsors, as well as the Canadian American Business Council, we are hosting an election night returns watching party here in Washington. So if you happen to be in DC during the election, we'd love to have you. Details will be forthcoming, but if you aren't on our regular mailing list, you just saw this on Eventbrite or something, let me know and I'd be happy to add you to that list. Should be fun. And for those of you who haven't been on a campus in a while, the co-sponsorship means the snacks will be decent. Just to give credit where credit's due. I also want to add a particular sort of thank you to our current sponsor, Global Public Affairs, a consultancy in Canada that does terrific work on strategic communications, as well as political and other consulting, management consulting. They've been friends of this school for quite a long time, helping us when we bring students up to Canada to meet with some of Canada's best decision makers, but most importantly, in recent years, sponsoring the series Canada in Washington that we do, trying to bring the best of Canada here to DC, or at least a slice of the best of Canada, which is an infinitely large population. This first panel is mine to moderate, and we have, and they're not in order, I don't think, but I'll ask them to raise their hand when I introduce them so you can connect the name to the face. We have Vince Amadeo, who is with Global Public Affairs. He's a research analyst and has done quite a bit of work on digital economy sort of policy for Global, and I'm a big fan because he sends out research updates which are called Global Public Affairs Insights, which several of them very, very good. Then we have William Carter, Carter, who is a Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at the Technology Policy Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which, if you look out the front door, is sort of across the way on the other side of the Philippine Embassy. So we really stretched the budget to pay his travel expenses to get him over here, but we're very glad to have him. And then we have Neil Parmenter. Neil is the president and CEO of the Canadian Bankers Association. As you'll see, banking is a sector we're watching fairly closely with everything digital. And then last but by no means least, we have Zane Schwartz. Zane is a reporter with a online journalist venture capital funded creative enterprise called The Logic. And if you're not subscribing, you should. They are a terrific way to track what's going on in the digital economy in Canada. If you're familiar with The Intelligence, which I think is one of the not peers, but it's the American version of very Silicon Valley, this would be the rough equivalent for Canada. And you can find a lot on The Intelligence. You can find a lot in The Intelligence about the digital economy. You can find a lot on the digital economy in the U.S. generally. But when you're looking for that level of quality and what's going on in Canada, there's no better place than The Logic. So that's our panel. You're stuck with me as the moderator. So now I'm going to move to the chair. All right. So we wanted this to be a discussion that would have a little more fluidity than we often have at academic conferences. So I wanted to just steer a few questions to all of you and give you a chance to well, just talk a little bit about today's topic. I'm going to start with Vince. one of the things that got us to having this conversation is Canada's new digital charter. You've written a lot about it. Can you tell us a little bit about what's in it and how it might affect business?
Yeah, no, happy to. The digital charter was released in late May of this year, 2019. It's the result of just over a year of consultation with the private sector, different government entities, kind of led through Minister Bains in Canada, who is responsible for this portfolio. The digital charter is mostly right now a set of ideas as to where the government will look to put legislation and where their focus is in terms of regulating the digital space moving forward. It has kind of at this point very broad, lofty goals in terms of, the main themes are universal access, leveling the digital playing field, transparency and portability of personal data, as well as it includes a few chapters on regulating online hate and misinformation in Canada as well. So obviously, very massive themes to put it into one document, and it's certainly the first step of a longer process in Canada that should span several years in terms of actually making sure we get this right, as well as making sure that these regulations and future laws are enforceable and make people accountable.
Just to put a date on, when did they roll this out, and have we had any test cases that have on the charter that are worth noting at this point, or is it just early days?
Yeah, it's early days. So May this year, late May, 2019. Obviously, with the election set for October, they didn't sit over the summer, so it hasn't really been debated. It was more of if we kind of renew our mandate, this is where we will look to build regulation around, and this is where our focus will be. I think all major parties will look to do something in this space. This just gives us the best insight to what the Prime Minister's team, if reelected, what they would do and what they would focus on.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Will, at CSIS, you co-authored a paper, I think back in June, that looked at sort of the global governance challenges. And I know this has been on the G7 agenda. There's been a lot of discussion about it in the G20. Can you tell us a little bit how do you think one other thing. I know your paper actually laid out principles for good governance in this area. So maybe to focus on those, what do you think is really needed? And to the extent you've had a chance to take a look, what do you think of how Canada started?
Sure. So our paper was really focused on data governance, and in particular, giving us a new paradigm to think about data governance that goes beyond traditional GDPR or privacy concepts. And I think in many ways, the Canadian Digital Charter is very encouraging in that it follows some of the key principles that we laid out for good data governance. So having a positive vision. So all the language in the Digital Charter, as you heard, it's very high level, but it's all around facilitating ethical use of data, facilitating responsible use of data, not limiting the use of data, protecting people from evil companies and governments. It takes a broader view than a relatively narrow view of the equities of the data subject. So I think that's one thing that often gets lost in data governance conversations is there are a lot of people in the digital economy. There are a lot of different groups that have important equities in play. And so one of the things that I think is great about the way that the Digital Charter was developed was it was developed in close consultation with business, with civil society within Canada, along with the public. And so you really see that reflected in the different equities that are reflected in the document. I also would say, though, that the Digital Charter is so much broader than that particular piece that we put out at CSIS. So in addition to data governance, it's looking at how to foster innovation and how to help to manage disruptions in the labor market from digital transformation. And I think, it actually echoes in many ways another document that we had done at CSIS a few years ago on what a strategy for AI automation, kind of a next generation digital transformation could look like for the US. And I was really encouraged to see that the charter hits many of our key themes from that document. So, ensuring a basic level of digital literacy for all Canadians, as opposed to a really strong emphasis on advanced STEM skills for everyone. Things like ensuring that you're facilitating partnerships, both international and domestic, that can facilitate greater innovation, a focus on mobility, a focus on finding meaningful ways for government to support innovation from the academic sector all the way to applications and businesses. And so I thought the charter is really impressive. I think the question that I always ask when I see these things is, what is the next step? So it's so high level, and there appears to be virtually no actual policy laid out in the document. So I think I'm curious to see what the next step will be for Canada.
Excellent. Neil, I can't think of a sector that would get more caught in the middle of something like this, between credit scores and cryptocurrency and people's concern about not only privacy, but making sure their money's still where it's supposed to be. Banking's right at the heart of this. From the Canadian banking sector's perspective, or if you can speak more broadly to Canadian finance generally, what's your read of this charter? Is it the right direction? Is it maybe too constrictive? How would you view it?
Yeah, so I'd sort of echo the sentiments that were just discussed, which is that it's encouraging and critical. I think if we're going to have a digital economy and an innovation economy, we need to take a holistic look at these issues and not sort of a checklist side by side. And that's typically, if I'm speaking among friends, often the way governments do approach things is they tend to sort of say, this is a cybersecurity issue, this is a privacy issue, this is a fair and open access issue. And at the end of the day, you can't really do that if we're going to talk about themes like we're talking about today. So we're really actually encouraged that that while, yes, it's very high level, and in essence, they've released 10 principles at this point, we need to start the conversation at some point. And so you can sit back and say, I want government to fix it, or I want someone to take care of this. Or as an industry like the one I represent, you can say, look, we do have a lot of history, a lot of capability and expertise in terms of ensuring Canadians can trust that their financial institution is going to keep their information safe and secure. We have expertise we can share. But also, I think our view is that at the end of the day, we see this as really an ecosystem, and that our industry would be one important piece of that ecosystem. But if you think about the rest of your life as a consumer, you have trusted relationships with, say, your cell phone provider, or your telecommunications provider, with your healthcare provider, with your academic institution, whatever the case may be. We need to take a look at an ecosystem so that we can ensure that we can triangulate and frankly validate, yes, Neil is who he says he is when he wants to take on new credit or apply for a mortgage for a home. We have a digital society and a focus on digital innovation, but if you look at how we authenticate ourselves today, we do it all in a very analog way. So in our industry, we ask people to come into our branches and take out a piece of plastic with your name on it, and take out a pen and write a signature. And there's a false sense of security with that, particularly among Canadians that are older, where they're used to that. In our view, it's just impossible to continue on that route. And so there are many different ways we can authenticate people digitally. And what we've been advocating for, which we see the digital charter being an important part of, is a national digital ID system for Canada that would be an important partnership between industries like ours and various levels of municipal, provincial, and federal government.
Excellent. So Zane, you've watched all of this from your ringside seat as an expert journalist in this area. How do you think, Neil's term, the digital ecosystem is going to be shaped by this? And is there, since we have a lot of Americans in the audience, is there maybe a sense of Canada being a regulatory or sort of digital leader on this, trying to create a governance framework that might be a competitive edge for Canada? Or is this going to be something like the carbon tax, where people worry that it's holding people back against the U.S., which is more competitive?
Yeah, for sure. I think at this point, all of that is dependent on the election results. I mean, I agree with everyone that this is very much a plan to make a plan. There's no legislation introduced. If the Liberals lose on October 21st, basically none of this matters. And there is a real possibility of that. So one of the things that a lot of the industry sources I'm speaking with focus on is, what are the areas of overlap between potential governments? So even if there is a conservative government, 2 days ago they put out a policy focused on cybersecurity and AI regulation. So we are going to see some work on that pretty much no matter what. There's a non-trivial chance right now of a minority government propped up potentially by the NDP. They've been talking a lot about a tax on tech giants, so your Amazons, your Netflix. that wouldn't necessarily make it into the coalition, wouldn't necessarily become legislation, but there's a big degree of flux right now. But regardless of what happens in the election, a lot of these issues have already been taken up by Canada's regulators in a way that's going to affect industry no matter what. So just yesterday, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, not to tell you, Neil, announced a crackdown on certain aspects of the banking sector. I spoke with the competition commissioner about 2 weeks ago. He's very interested in big tech enforcement. He's very interested in working with the Department of Justice and the FTC here, going after some of the practices around alleged abuse of market dominance by tech giants. And Canada's privacy commissioner has been beating this drum for about 2 years, and he's got quite a bit of his term left. He really wants federal political parties and wide swaths of Canadian society to be required to do more on AI. To do more on privacy in the digital realm. So you've got sort of 3 of Canada's, I mean, they're not comparatively powerful regulators who are beating this drum no matter what. And you have an election where this is an issue, but it really does depend. Like there's overlap on cybersecurity and AI, but the Conservatives do not, for example, talk as much about misinformation or hate speech online. That is something that would definitely depend on the election outcome.
And put you on the spot a little bit. How tech literate would you judge Canadian politicians to be? I mean, I can certainly say in the U.S. there are some highs and lows, but what would you say on average?
So Canada hosted the International Grand Committee, which was Canada, the UK, 11 other parliaments, and it was supposed to be an attempt to grill the biggest tech CEOs in the world. So Mark Zuckerberg didn't want to show up. No one actually came. It wasn't quite as bad as some of the U.S. Senate hearings, but there were some odd questions. I mean, I think that's also why the work with industry becomes so important, because sometimes there is sort of that lack of literacy. And on a more granular level, 2 of the biggest leaders of that, there's a real chance they're going to lose their seats. So it really does depend what happens the next month.
Wow.
Yeah.
Which leads me back to you, Vince. I mean, so we know we've got a promise here, or at least a potential. So can you look into your crystal ball? I mean, what's likely to happen? Assuming the government's returned, how would it proceed? And if there is a change, how high up is this going to be on the agenda of whoever takes over?
Yeah, that's quite a bit to unpack. First off, just to kind of build off what Zane was mentioning, this is being kind of carried out now in different aspects of government, with specifically in the Competition Bureau, with the appointment of Canada's first Chief Digital Enforcement Officer. So you will start to see that, similar to what's happened in Europe and the US to a degree, that microscope on big tech and the ethical use of data, stuff like that. If we're looking at how this gets picked up after the election, I think it really depends. I think from what Minister Baines has said, I mean, what was the most shocking to me was in terms of when he announced, he said, we've lost trust. How do we build that trust back? And I think that's something that should concern anyone who would form government in Canada. If citizens feel that they can't trust the government to protect their data online, they can't trust anybody, that's really bad for the market. It's bad for everybody. So there will be kind of nuanced approach. So between the Liberals and Conservatives, how it shakes out in the end will be different. Historically, and from what has been said to date, the Conservatives would still like to take a more hands-off approach. But I think we've gone past self-regulation at this point. I think something does have to happen either way.
And let me push you on something that I always think the U.S. has a sort of competitive federalism. A lot of times the states and the federal government are racing in an area where they see a chance to make a popular policy decision or what have you, or respond to people's fears. But Canada's always tended to have a bit more of a collaborative federal system. How are the provinces responding to all of this? Is this so clearly federal jurisdiction they're happy to pass the potato to Ottawa, or are they experimenting a little bit as well?
They're certainly experimenting. So in Ontario, largest population by province, Canada's finance hub, they've launched a provincial data strategy. So similar to the digital charter, right now this is still very high level stuff. It's just, well, we know something has to be done, and it's figuring out what we'll do. I don't think there is a real plan to kind of step on toes and kind of recreate specific privacy legislation province by province. I mean, that would be a nightmare for an expanding Canadian small business to have to redo everything by province. But the regionalism is a real issue. You know, in Canada, we have BC with very different privacy, very different data residency laws than the rest of the country. You could look at Montreal and Alberta that looking to kind of continue to foster that competitive edge in AI, right? They want to keep those rising companies around. So I don't think they're going to go overly towards where they're stepping on each other's toes, but there certainly hasn't been this is just not our problem. We're going to do something about this as well.
So potentially in a minority government, if Ottawa is hamstrung, maybe the provinces will become more important.
Yeah.
So now that we've shattered the myth of a unified Canadian approach, we're talking about this international grand committee Zane mentioned. What's the state of international efforts to deal with this? Are we going to be able to cooperate on this so as well as we've cooperated on other fabulous international things like climate change, or is it going to be worse?
I think
What would that look like?
it would be a true shock to me if the international community were to get to the point where we could have a discussion about digital governance at with the scope of Canada's digital charter. The reality is that the way that the international system is set up, we have to look at things on a much more granular level and by each sub-issue. And so I think it's hard to say, can Canada collaborate in the international space or participate in international governance on all of the things in the digital charter, because, we have some issues like hate speech and malicious content where something is clearly going to happen. Then we have other areas, facilitating innovation through human capital development where I don't see a lot of international action happening. And so you kind of have a wide spectrum here. I think Canada certainly has an opportunity to weigh in on some of these issues, and I think Canada punches above its weight in some key categories. So, for example, in artificial intelligence, Canada punches significantly above its weight on the technical research side, on the application development side, and certainly on the governance side, and really is a voice that is listened to kind of out of proportion with its size in the global economy. Similarly, on digital governance, I think Canada is in an interesting position because Canada is currently positioned somewhere between the EU and the US models, to the extent that the US has a model that you could articulate. And I think there's an opportunity for Canada to offer a middle path that might bring both sides closer to consensus around data governance. That said, these are some of the toughest issues that we have in international governance today. They have significant national security implications. They have very significant economic implications, and particularly implications for the competitiveness of international businesses. And then they have significant social implications. And I think one of the challenges that we are trying to deal with at the international level, but truthfully, I think even domestically within the U.S. and I know within Canada as well, is there are cultural and historical forces that have shaped the way that people think about technology. And we've just reached the point where the existing vestigial governance models are no longer adequate. But everyone has a different vision for where they want this to go. And so I'm a little bit pessimistic about short-term international progress on some of the key issues here, because I think, truthfully, countries like the U.S. and Canada are going to have to build some consensus domestically, establish a cohesive and firm national position on these issues before we can really get people to a position where they're willing to advocate for their key equities and make concessions at the international level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much for that. I was going to follow up. There are always these talk shops like G7 and G20, but what do you think about the role that groups like the OECD in terms of doing policy comparative work or groups with business people in them, like the World Economic Forum? How do those kind of groups maybe help or foster some convergence on this internationally?
So both the OECD and the WEF have played a really significant role in a lot of these issues. And I think actually in some ways they are the only plausible forum for some of the kind of early policy development work to be done. So you take AI governance, for example, the OECD not only moved first among the major international organizations on AI governance, but it was one of the few organizations where they allowed the wonks to wonk. What we've actually seen is the OECD came out with their AI principles, and then in June in Osaka in Japan, having gone to Japan for the digital ministerial, everyone was hoping to make progress on data governance, and that ended up being really, really hard. But there were these OECD AI principles, and everyone was like, these we can kind of get behind. Obviously, they had to be rebranded because some G20 members, China, are not OECD members and therefore would not endorse anything under that brand. But they were literally copied verbatim and are now the G20 AI governance principles. But I think that's really a path that I expect us to see more. Part of it is we'll be moving from coalitions of the willing and coalitions of the like-minded to broad adoption of principles, as opposed to trying to get these big consensus, grand vision, international agreements from scratch. And as I said, the smaller organizations, they have less players at the table, and they tend to let the wonks wonk. And so I think there's a lot of room for them to lead.
Fantastic. Neil, another one of the great divides here that I think you're caught in the middle of is the divide between the governed and the governors. And we are often, certainly in the US, I think sometimes in Canada, disengaged citizens, but highly engaged consumers. And I wonder, being caught in the middle, government wants you to do this, what are you hearing back from consumers? Are you the bad guy imposing rules and making their lives miserable? Do they see you as needing to do more than just the government minimum? What's the consumer appetite for your sector leading or other business sectors leading on this, or they prefer the government does that?
So I would say, back to that issue of trust, is that, and all the survey data, our own survey and several third parties, shows that Canadians place a high degree of trust in their financial institutions. So that's something the industry is always very conscious of, particularly in the sort of the digital space. At times, there are tests to that imposed by government that, to your point, do put banks in the middle. So a U.S. example is when FATCA was introduced, and FATCA, for those that don't know, was an IRS initiative to try to find U.S. citizens living elsewhere in the globe, ensure that they were paying their share of taxes. And the demand and the ask of Canadian financial institutions at the time, this was several years ago, was to identify Americans and make sure that information was shared with the IRS. And of course, that placed banks in at best, a gray area of the law, if not on offside with Canadian privacy laws. And so at times, when those tests come, we hear loudly from banking customers. Another area would be requests for data. So last fall, there was an issue with Statistics Canada, which had asked banks to share financial data of Canadians so that data could be analyzed for research purposes. And that resulted in a very high-profile test case that was played out both in the media and the government had several hearings, including I had to go appear at that. So that issue at the end was resolved, but it really highlights that whenever consumers fear that the lines, wherever those lines are, and they're certainly largely in people's minds, they're in our collective minds as opposed to prescriptive pieces of legislation, you can instantly get some blowback.
Well, and that makes me think so much policy change is driven by disasters. Your sector has always been subject to hacking. I think even back to the war games era when Matthew Broderick was in the movie, looked like he's 12, still does. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, do you feel that people are welcoming this because it's better to be prepared? Canadians do like to be prepared, or are we waiting for the next big hack that takes a Canadian bank to the cleaners, and then there's a crisis, and then everybody demands action beyond what's been done so far?
Yeah. So the good news is we haven't had that kind of incident in Canada where funds have disappeared. It's happened in other jurisdictions around the world, and it's certainly the number one worry of every one of my board members and every one of the bank CEOs. I think what's really encouraging and beyond the principles we're talking about today is there's a new Canadian Center for Cybersecurity. There's tremendous cooperation now between our intelligence service in Canada, law enforcement, as I said, big industries like ours in terms of information sharing. And what's been really challenging throughout the years as someone who's been there for 25 years is that banks are conservative and they're often worried about things like contagion and information getting out about Bank A or Bank B. And so when there have been incidents in the past, it's been challenging at times to get people to share safely. Hey, we're seeing this over here at this bank. You might be experiencing something similar. Look out for this kind of intrusion. I would say over the last 10 years, enormous progress has been made, and with the launch of the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity last year, I think we've actually broken the back of that. And some of the arguments you would have heard previously, which is lawyers saying, well, we're worried about class action lawsuits and all these sorts of things. I think Canada truly is a world leader in taking that issue seriously and putting together the requisite component parts of the ecosystem to combating that. I think the next phase is to do it at the G7 level. So when I'm part of an organization called the International Banking Federation, which is comprised of sort of people in my chair from G7 countries, and these are our regulators, prudential regulators, are pushing us to ensure there's greater global cooperation. So now that's again taking another big leap in trust around the world. But as a proud Canadian, I think that Canada actually has a pretty strong case to be made that we truly are global leaders in this space, and a lot of countries can learn from Canada's experience about, again, all rooted in tremendous cooperation between industry and government.
So that brings me back to you, Zane. I know the U.S. is the U.S., of course. Are there any ideas, though, that we've come up with or that are being put forward by, say, tech firms here in the U.S. that you think might be adaptable, of value to Canada as they move forward? I mean, or are we just going to get all our great ideas from Canada as usual?
All great ideas from Canada. Next question. No, I mean, this current Canadian federal government is very, very interested in what the largest tech firms are interested in, especially regulation-wise. So you've seen a real push for self-regulation. Facebook came out with a white paper identifying some areas in which they'd like to be regulated, and a whole bunch of areas in which they'd like no one to look at them. Yesterday, the president of Microsoft spoke about the importance of regulating for facial recognition technology. I mean, and that was a bit of a shot at Amazon and Palantir, but whatever, take it for what it's worth. One of the things that my colleagues and I have been tracking very closely is the lobbying influence of these companies in Canada. So Amazon alone met with the Trudeau government, has met with the Trudeau government, the equivalent of once every 3 days during their mandate. So these folks, not necessarily a bad thing, but they will play an outsized role in this. And I think that if you see a U.S. push towards self-regulation, Canada is likely to follow. There's been some push from Canada's telecom industry to have more regulation, and broadcasting industry to have more regulation around the Netflix, Amazon Primes of this world. That's largely been a non-starter, not entirely, but largely been a non-starter. So I think one of the big questions, depending on the results of this election, is, well, number one is, if the Conservatives do win, can these tech firms continue their prominent role in Ottawa policymaking? If the Liberals win, what will that mean in terms of a lot of these issues, like the digital charter, to plan to make a plan? When we get down to the brass tacks, what will these things actually look like? And I think you have Canadian groups that are forming to try to combat that. You have the Council of Canadian Innovators, who was initially very happy about the digital charter, but I've been speaking with them in recent months, and they're happy with it if anything actually ever happens. So that'll be a big question as well. You do have a booming Canadian domestic tech industry. You have Toby Luke, the CEO of Shopify, who's been becoming increasingly outspoken about the influence of other large tech firms in Ottawa. He would like to have more influence, wouldn't we all? But yeah, so I think that's an open question for sure.
Well, I'm going to push you on maybe one particular thing. The U.S., we all seem to be uniting against China and the tech firms these days. I don't know what that says about our desire to have a big enemy, but both Republicans and Democrats have put out the use in the United States of antitrust legislation to try to break up what they see to be the sort of market dominance of some of these firms. Canada, historically, by contrast, has favored, maintaining semi-oligopolies, the five big banks or, other groupings, letting a little bit of competition, but being a little bit more tolerant of the dominance of a few firms in sectors. Do you think Canada would jump on an antitrust bandwagon, play wait and see, prefer a different path entirely to dealing with these companies?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, Canada's open to oligopolies when they're Canadian oligopolies.
Right. Good point.
Is the simple answer. And Neil, feel free to jump in, tell me I'm wrong at any point. No, but I mean, where you have seen pushback against tech, it does largely come from established Canadian industries objecting. So the three largest telecoms have been very vocal about their frustration around the lack of a company like Netflix having to produce Canadian content or having to pay sales tax on most jurisdictions, which creates a lot of, it creates a competitive advantage for them. The second part of that is Canada has a new competition commissioner. Matthew Boswell has been in place for about 5 months. I spoke with him a couple of times now. He's very, very eager to work with the U.S. He's very, very eager to focus on tech. He's received one mandate letter from Minister Baines at this point. It's just focused on tech regulation. Like, this is the #1 issue for him. Whether we'll see the kind of aggressive antitrust enforcement like you're seeing in the U.S. around Google, we'll see. We'll see. He doesn't really have the manpower to do it, but I think he wants to. So we'll see.
Yeah, interesting. So at this point, I want to open it up to all of you in the audience, and we have a microphone at the back. If you want to stand up and ask your question there, it'll go out into our recording. If you don't, I know some students are shy, I will just repeat whatever you say. How's that? Sort of ventriloquism. So if you want to make me say something silly for a great YouTube clip, this is your chance. But if anybody has a question, feel free. Oh, excellent.
Very brave.
If I heard the question correctly, I think what you're focused more on is on regulation of big tech as opposed to, say, my industry. Is that?
I disagree completely. I mean, it's also how privacy gets handled
Yeah.
and how data is handled. So I think the big tech offers delivery mechanisms
Yep.
for that. But all these industries seem to have
I think that recent events, particularly for some of the large, there's sort of the big 4 or 5 tech players that you basically can't get on the internet without nowadays, have had their fair share of challenges throughout the world, and including Canada. And so I think that for a variety of reasons, and I think innovation's a big one, governments, particularly Canadian government, has been hesitant to regulate tech players because they don't want to stifle innovation. And we talked about AI as another example. Kind of the next wave is is there a risk to stifling innovation if you over-regulate, and particularly do so very prescriptively? So I can understand the hesitancy for these newer industries for governments to be a little more hands-off. I think, Cambridge Analytica, all these sorts of events have led Canadians to question the relationship with some of their tech providers, and I think it's long been established throughout the world that not many consumers read the terms of agreement that they have with their social media provider or their tech provider. And I think now those things are being tested, and they're being tested, particularly here in the U.S. I know there's everyone in Canada is watching with great interest what the Justice Department is going to do. And so I think that's been fueling a lot of that angst among people that for the first time, although they might have been using some of these services for 10, 15 years now, they are legitimately asking questions as to who owns my data, who owns information about me, and what are my rights.
Well,
You were asking about where the kind of impetus for a lot of this tech governance push has come from, and I would say I take a very cynical view, having spent a lot of time talking to policymakers who, have just realized, oh, there's tech out there, and I can, pass popular policies that will crack down on them. I think actually in a lot of cases, a lot of this is coming from within government. And from government stakeholders who feel that their equities are compromised. So, for example, I think a lot of the concerns around tech have to do with the distribution of tax revenues from online services, and that's governments want more money. A lot of it has to do with the fact that changes in technology, and particularly the architecture of where data lives in the internet and how it's protected, have made it really hard to do law enforcement, which government views as one of its key functions: public safety, public stability. I think a lot of it has to do with the desire to foster competitive domestic businesses, but they're struggling to compete against established international players that are always going to have, bigger budgets and kind of advantages of scale. And so when you actually look at the claims that are made, about the public's desire for privacy, all of the data seems to suggest that that is just not the case. So I used to be an economist in a previous life, and I always go back to something from my econ classes, a concept called revealed preference. So there's what you say you want, and then there's what your behavior reveals you actually were, kind of optimizing for. So people say they want privacy, but then they sign away their data without even reading the terms of service, because what they really want is the service facilitated by the data. And when you look at why many countries that have passed new privacy laws or restrictions on certain technologies have failed to enforce those laws, it's often because truly enforcing those laws, for example, around encryption or around international data transfers, would mean that their citizens would lose access to Netflix or Google or WhatsApp. And the citizens are clearly saying to their governments, what I care about more is WhatsApp. Do I care about enforcement of your law, or do I care about WhatsApp? I care about WhatsApp. And so I just take a very cynical view. I think policymakers, for sometimes very legitimate reasons, like we want to be able to enforce the laws. We want to be able to protect the public from murderers, and tech has implications for that. But they're being driven by internal forces. And I think a lot of times they bolt on the justification of consumer outrage, and they go out of their way to foster that consumer outrage to justify the policies that they're pursuing.
Just to make things a bit more fun, I'm not sure there's really any evidence to support that, to be honest. So on the consumer level, I think in Canada, you have seen hundreds of thousands of people write in to protect net neutrality. Now, I don't think the Trudeau government was ever going to undermine net neutrality, but God knows these people wanted the Trudeau government to know that that was an issue. I also think that another major factor here is some of it's consumer-based. You have seen, and maybe there's a news report, and then a regulator will launch an investigation into, let's say, the collection of data by telecoms, and then that trickles up into legislation. but I think the bigger factors are companies who are concerned about market share. So to use the telecom industry again, my outlet reported on Canada has 3 telecoms. Basically, that's it. We got a bunch of documents about how Google is interested in coming to Canada to launch the same type of Google Fi service that they have. So telecoms go into overdrive perfectly reasonably to protect their market share. And there's all kinds of push for new regulations to try to block that type of thing because of that. Similarly, you have Amazon and Apple getting into the fintech space. There's a desire, especially for companies within a country that have largely enjoyed a certain amount of regulatory protection, to safeguard that. I mean, the reason India is cracking down on Walmart and Amazon doesn't have to do with a consumer desire. It has to do with protecting a domestic retail industry. They don't want that to be completely carved out. And I think that, especially the farther you get from the US, these companies are very powerful, but they don't necessarily have the deep roots or the connections in other countries' regulatory landscapes to deal. Like so far, Google's winning a fight against telecoms, which have been in the country for 200 years. We'll see.
Excellent. Other questions? Sir? Sure.
In particular. And so I wondered both sort of where the status is of that, where it might be going, and where it would be going in the context of both the USMCA and the elections in October.
Yeah, I'll take that one. I mean, our privacy commissioner is sort of a fascinating player in all of this. He's interpreted legislation in a way that is closer to the European model. So not just around that, but also around things like the right to be forgotten. And then there's been a series of challenges to those interpretations. So the reason why we have that ongoing consultation is because there's sort of a real fight around it. I think one of it really just is a judicial question at this point. But you do have Canada's top privacy regulator who would like to see much stricter regulations around data portability, around cross-border transfers. He's got all kinds of concerns around the national security implications of sending data to the US. But of course, practically the way the internet is built, if you send an email, it's going to the US. That is likely to be caught up in the courts for the next few years. The consultations are not unimportant, but kind of no matter what happens, they'll be in the courts. But he will keep pushing that issue. And you could have, if it goes through the courts, it'll be resolved in like 3 years. If it bubbles up into the public consciousness, legislation could be passed at any time. But yeah, the consultations are secondary to the ongoing lawsuits. Short answer.
And then maybe just to build on an earlier question Chris had, this kind of talk about regional differences, regional approaches. So BC right now has a data residency policy, right? Government data can't go through the US, it has to stay in Canada. So we have seen in the absence of, clear federal decision or a decision made by the courts, some province saying, you know what, this is important enough to us that we'll pass our own legislation to ensure our data is safe and through their metrics protected within the country.
Let me push you just a bit on that. I'm kind of a trade guy, and the USMCA has a number of provisions, including prohibitions on data localization, requirements that you have a right to cross-border downloads, which suggests that you might be able to get your Netflix movie from the other side of the border, unlike your, drugstore novel or that you pick up in the airport. And also commitments for limited liability on platforms for third-party content. How do those kinds of provisions, I know they haven't taken effect yet, our guys are still debating that on Capitol Hill now. How do those kind of commitments jibe with what politicians are saying they want to do for Canadians?
Yeah, it depends on the politician. I think, the Liberals have been outspoken in terms of wanting this new data economy. They want Canadians to access the best and the brightest they want. Increase consumer choice. What Will was saying around consumers are more picky than ever in terms of, well, this is what I want. I can get it in the private sector. Why is there government? Impetus, why is this in front of me? I should be able to access it. Anecdotally, Rod and I have DAZN. We were trying to watch the NFL yesterday. We can't watch it in the States because the license only applies to Canada. So despite the fact that I pay the same price, I get different service offerings depending on location. So I really think it depends the politician, and we will see in terms of kind of post-ratification adjustments around what kind of has worked, what hasn't. How do we kind of reformulate and make sure that in practice is what they were envisioning when they signed it.
Excellent. Any other comments on this one? Back to the audience. Other questions, comments?
Yeah, hi, Chris, and thanks again for the panel. Actually, just maybe I could pose this to probably mainly Zane, but in Canada, it seems like the digital charter was almost like a last-minute decision that they needed to make before the election. We got to get something announced. As much as Canada, for the past 4 years and even before that, was trying to attract a lot of the big tech companies to come to Canada, we're also seeing that kind of backlash at the community level, nowhere more so than in Toronto with the Sidewalk Labs project with Google. So I was wondering if maybe you could just discuss that and maybe open up to the panelists. I mean, on the one hand, it's been seen as this great, economic driver, and let's get more tech into Canada, and welcome these companies. But, now we're starting to see that foot drop. And as one of the questions earlier was, is that coming from the top down, or is that truly coming from the grassroots?
I mean, in many ways, the brilliance of the digital charter was both big tech and Canadian tech were happy with it because it was a statement of principles. Mm-hmm. So it allowed them to put off any decision making until after the election. But part of the reason why they wanted to put that off is because there was that growing tension. So briefly, as many of you may know, Google wanted to build its first smart city anywhere in the world. They chose Toronto. Toronto chose them. There's been a lot of backlash and concern around that since. Concerns around privacy issues, but also just concerns around sort of more basic democracy issues. So the final proposal suggests that Google will collect a portion of property tax. So there are certain municipal politicians who say, hold up, you're not a government, why are you collecting tax? There's other folks who say, you're massively going to increase the property values of this area, going to fulfill a lot of the basic services, garbage collection, street sweeping, etc. Why not collect a little bit of tax as a way of that? That project has a very similar deadline to the Ontario election. So the federal election. A federal election is October 21st. October 31st is the date when Sidewalk Labs in Waterfront Toronto, which is the government agency they're negotiating with, need to either say we've reached a deal or pull out. Politicians are trying to stay away from it for the most part, I think because there's been a backlash, but there's also been huge support. There are many, many people who are very excited about it. The public position, the government agency has said, we're open to it, but we're going to give you a lot less land than you want. And Dan Dockeroff, who's the head of Sidewalk Labs, has said, no, we want the full 191 acres, I think it is. But yeah, I think that's certainly a potential election issue and something that a new government will have to deal with no matter what. But I don't know. I'd be very interested in what others think of the project.
Yeah, I mean, from a local perspective in Toronto, to build off what Zane said, very, very polarizing, and opinions are passionate on either side. Politicians are still maybe feeling it out, dancing around where they should go in. There have been some outspoken against it on Toronto City Council, but the mayor has been relatively supportive of the entire process, kind of waving it as a success for the city of Toronto to to partner with such a big global leader company like Sidewalk Labs. And then you have on the flip side, so members within his own council kind of express concerns. You also have Premier Ford then mention he's not sure about it. So it is coming up, and as kind of this election takes forward, we will hear more opinions on it. I think it now remains something that people are quite passionate about without fully understanding the entirety and then the complexity of the issue. So as it gets closer to that end of October end date, I think you'll see a lot more attention paid on a lot more specific focus at, well, I like this aspect specifically. This is problematic, and some back and forth on that front.
Maybe not weighing in quite as much on the specific project, which I haven't tracked as closely, but I think that it sounds like it's reflecting a broader tension, which is I don't think people know what they think of the idea of smart cities yet. So to some people, smart cities is the path to the Star Trek world where you say what you want and the machine literally makes it appear in front of you. And to some people, it's Minority Report. And there's not a lot of middle ground. I put that somewhat on the Hollywood folks. It makes for a better story if technology makes everything better or everything terrible. But I think that's a genuine tension that is happening around the world when it comes to smart cities. But I think one interesting question, more from a policy and kind of implementation perspective, is there are two broad approaches being taken to smart cities. So one is what I call the more Chinese model, where China has approached smart cities as something that you build from scratch as a kind of integrated service package. Whereas some of the cities in the US that have done Smart Cities project, it's basically an iterative process where you introduce individual intelligentized services and sensor packages and things in different parts of the city. Often it starts from very, very local scales, a few blocks, and then expands out. And often you're starting with one very targeted thing. So for example, city bikes is kind of an intelligentized city service that's become very popular. And I think there's the question of which of these models will end up predominating globally. In some ways, I think there are advantages to the iterative model because it lets people just have the piece, like one small piece, it's not too scary, and you realize you like it, and then you start to think maybe I want something else. But I think there are also, advantages, putting that skeptical hat back on for policymakers, the integrated services model, and particularly a model which creates a lot of data that is owned by government, municipal and larger governments, is really appealing. And so I think it will be interesting to see how smart cities continue to evolve more broadly.
Just to build on that quickly, some of the technologies that are most controversial in Sidewalk Labs already exist in cities across Canada and the US, and very successfully. So probably the cleanest example is smart traffic lights. So they're public-private partnerships between cities and companies usually. Companies come in, they make traffic more efficient, which helps people get to work on time. Cities are very happy about it, and they get paid a service fee. They, use cameras to look at traffic flows so they know when you need a longer green light. Like, it's not actually that complex, but there are companies that do it really, really well. And there are some folks have privacy concerns around the cameras, but generally speaking, I think they're in 30, maybe 31 municipalities in Canada right now, like very popular. And you're seeing that backlash in Toronto because it's integrated, because it's alongside 30 other services, because there's a concern about a panopticon. But yeah, there's potential there.
I'm going to push a little bit on that if I can. So the digital charter talks about privacy and the importance of that, but I think one thing that people are worried about, and maybe it's just the nature of Washington, we always follow the money here. One of the commitments we've heard from politicians, including the charter, is making providing access to public data. And particularly as you bring in AI to crunch the numbers and use the data, to what extent is there concern in Canada, or perhaps there isn't, I don't know, regarding the giveaway of public data to companies that then mine it, make money, that the taxpayer doesn't see any of, nor does the government necessarily, depending, especially if your principle is to make this data available publicly. Anyone?
Yeah, that concern certainly exists. I think it's been the flagship argument of Jim Mussolini, so the co-chair of the Canadian Council of Innovators, has been very concerned with of data ownership afterwards. So it's great that Sidewalk Labs is going to come and revitalize an area of Toronto that the city has had real problems getting going for many years. But in terms of how do we get the data afterwards? How does that partnership work? What aspects of the data will be made public? Obviously shouldn't, what can't be, what won't be, and that juxtaposition. I think it's a lot right now in terms of how do we consumer face the data? How do we use this data to provide kind of the best consumer, best user experience, while still making people feel comfortable, making people have that base level of trust in terms of it's not Skynet. And back to Hollywood, that is an argument that actually is made. So it's a combination of both, but I think data ownership, especially from Canadian companies concerned with the influence of bigger giants, that data ownership piece is quite important.
Neil, anybody?
So on the question of governments making data available, but also on the broader data ownership question, in our data governance principles, one of the things we emphasized was moving away from ownership paradigms for data governance because they create really significant challenges. So once the data is given away, are there any controls on how that data is used, how that data is subsequently shared? Does that control have to be exercised by the individual who now 18, hops away, has no idea what's going on and can't possibly manage all of the permutations of their data that are out there in the world? And so I think we're going to end up, just from an operational perspective, having to move away from ownership as the basis of rights in the digital world. And so then you start to talk about, how do I think about governance of the use of data as opposed to solely governance of access to data? I think that's where we ultimately are going to have to go. But the other thing on the open government data, it's become somewhat controversial in the US as well, but the irony is that some of the biggest focuses are on the non-personal data. And that's where we actually see some of the greatest potential value from opening up government data sets. And I think there are two historical examples that are really powerful. So two of the data sets that have created the most value, economic value in the United States are NOAA's weather data and the National Geological Services data on the topography and geology of the United States. There is no personal data in this. There's really nothing controversial about it. It was collected by government to serve the public. And so the idea that it's made freely available to anyone that wants to use it, I think is really great. And we've seen a huge amount of economic value created over the years. People ask, what do you expect the biggest, economic impacts of AI to be? And I say, it's going to be really hard to beat Walmart and Amazon's supply chain management systems or Google Search, which have had just tremendous ones. But look at the use of NOAA data in supply chain management and logistics management. I mean, it's huge. It creates a huge amount of value. And when people say it's not going to the consumers, I say there is a appreciable amount of the price discount that you get at Walmart that comes from their ability to leverage that NOAA data. And so I think we have to be clear about what we're talking about. If the government were taking data that they collected on individuals and their personal behavior and their tax data and publishing it in a non-anonymized form, that would obviously raise huge concerns. But I think open government data is something that is incredibly powerful, and where in a lot of cases there are not really that many ethical or kind of moral quandaries we have to deal with.
A couple small points on this. I mean, I think it's an incredibly important question, in large part because the conservatives, who could very easily form the next government, have talked about this. This is important to them. And partially for some of those economic benefits that you're talking about. The question will be, what data will they open up? So as I don't have to tell Neil, we have a chief statistician who is coming up with all kinds of new data that he's interested in collecting. And that could put Statistics Canada on a bit of a collision course with a variety of different industries. So to give you maybe the two quick examples, one, Canada released for the first time usage rates of cannabis across the country, and the way that they measured that was by analyzing sewage water. So they did it at a very high level, right? And they did it for, regardless of why they did it. They did it at a high level, like you cannot identify anyone. But that data does exist somewhere in a more granular way. They're also doing a lot of additional data collection around disease incidence rates, partially because of the rise of the anti-vaccination movement. Again, like as a government, personally, I'm comfortable with them trying to figure out what parts of Canada maybe need more healthcare or certain vaccinations. But again, those are perhaps examples of things like banking data, which can be very, very personal. I mean, to be fair, I don't think anyone specifically said they want to open that kind of thing up, but I think the point I'm just trying to make is we have these two tensions. We have a potential government which wants to open up this data, and we have a statistical collection agency which is collecting more and more personal data to try and inform policy, like, you know, working directly with Health Canada to try and make people more healthy. But these potential side effects of that could be a bit more Skynetty.
I like that as an adjective. Maybe go to one other level. One of the cases people here are tracking is the case where Eminem's lawyers are suing Spotify over the way in which they pay him royalties on his songs, and it's apparently some sort of abstract thing. It's not like we heard the song, 2 cents goes into his account. It's more of a, well, we think roughly, and it's people think in terms of payments that this could be potentially an important one. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about people's ability to get paid for data and for cultural content, because that's one of the areas Canada and the US have clashed before. Canadians trying to foster a local culture, Americans trying to commodify culture in all of its forms. And so, thank you, Disney. But I thought I would ask you a little bit about how these cultural issues and the issues of getting paid interact with some of what the digital charter provides.
Yeah, I'm certainly no expert on. I'm an Eminem fan, but no expert on the current one. I do know this. Spotify uses that algorithm. It's interesting. It's moving forward. It looks in terms of can use algorithms to better guess kind of human behavior than actually tracking one play equals 2 cents. Can we assume over a vast amount of users, this many people approximately listen to Eminem a day, and go from there. It's certainly gonna influence the way we move forward. I don't know that the digital charter's gotten that granular in terms of how we move forward on that from a policy perspective. But certainly, I mean, as you mentioned, the past tensions with the Canadian independent Canadian music, Canadian artists, and how do we kind of protect Canadian content, which is what Zane mentioned in terms of some of the competitive advantages of potentially Netflix have. So it will be certainly something to watch. I don't know that there's a path forward, a concrete plan in place yet to speak to.
The closest thing I can think of is the Globe and Mail. Just going to assume everyone's Canadian, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation have asked the federal government to make Google show them basically the back end of their search results, which speaks to sort of, I think, the same opacity issue. Mm-hmm. So if you're Eminem, you say, why are my checks so low? I'm Eminem, I'm amazing. If you're the Globe and Mail, you say, why am I losing so much money? I'm Canada's newspaper of record. So this is just a request. Like, I honestly have no insight into the federal government's willingness to do these things, but these are two of Canada's most powerful media companies. And I think what they're trying to leverage is the same amount of data that these large tech firms have about people that they feel are primarily their consumers. So if someone goes to Google and types in Globe and Mail, report on business, their argument is that person's looking for us. We should have access to that information. Why can you sell ads against that, but we can't? And I think you're seeing a bit of a growing movement around that, but it's fairly nascent. That's part of another review that's happening. So Canada's currently rewriting its Telecommunications, Broadcasting, and Radio Communications Acts, and we're going to get a report on that in January 2020. So whoever wins can deal with that.
I think one long-term trend, not specifically on the case of M&M, which, you know, truthfully, they'll figure it out. But I think that there's this broader question of a lot of companies are moving towards proxying instead of directly collecting data on their users, partly because of pushes to increase privacy. And in order to limit their responsibilities to protect and manage the data of their users, they're finding ways to provide their services in a personalized and targeted way without directly collecting the data. And so I think this is a conversation that we're going to be having a lot more over the next few years, because as more privacy laws come into effect, more companies cut down on the amount of direct collection that they're doing, are doing more proxying, and people are going to start to have questions about how they proxy and what the implications are for them. So I don't know what the resolution of the M&M case will be, but I would say this is going to be a very common debate over the next few years.
Mm-hmm. Very believable. Questions from the audience? Anyone burning with one? Justin. You can go there or speak loudly and I'll repeat it for the microphone.
Even Noah can become politicized. I'm wondering what models do you apply to stuff? The federal government could try to use internal commerce models, or would states' rights advocates say, no, it has to be a state issue? But a similar model can be replicated.
So for those of you who are watching the video, the question is really, is there a, given Canada's respect for civil servants, the less politicized civil service, not the swamp in Ottawa, maybe the muskeg, but not the swamp. Is there any way that some of these ideas that we're talking about here from Canada could be transplanted into the U.S., given the very different culture, different trust levels, and different dynamics? And maybe, Will, I'm turning to you only because, in addition to me, you're the only other American here. So America first, why don't you weigh in?
That's the problem.
Oh, yeah. Don't say America first in public. I think that the U.S. definitely has a much more complex federal versus state dynamic, but I would say that there's clearly an appetite for federal action on a lot of these things. We've actually seen a fair amount of activity at the state level on many of these issues, whether it's on the e-commerce side, data privacy side. I mean, you know, the California Privacy Act that recently came out, CCPA is essentially the driver of the meaningful efforts to get federal data privacy legislation in the U.S. The other thing I would say is the U.S. is coming under pressure internationally for not having one-stop shop federal laws on key digital issues. So people say the U.S. doesn't have a privacy policy, and we say we have many. And they say, okay, what are they? And we say, well, here's, 286 pages of just the reference links. If you actually open up the documents, it's going to be, 50,000 pages of God knows what. So I think there is an appetite for consolidation. There is an appetite to develop a consistent policy at the federal level, partly to avoid fragmentation. So like, take a data breach, right? Like financial institutions that operate across state lines, they're facing data breach policies. So if data is stolen from your system on your customers, who do you have to notify, in what time frame, and what information do you have to include? Every state in the United States now has a data breach law. They are all different. In some cases, they are conflicting. And so suddenly all these companies are in a literally impossible situation where they're in a conflict of laws. So a federal law to preempt the state laws is one solution to that. So yeah, I would say overall thing, states are already very active and have been very active. Federal government very much desire to do more in the United States, partly for the sake of the political points, partly because we need international policies that we can market, and partly to avoid regulatory fragmentation across the 50 states. And I think that that's basically inevitable at this point on a lot of issues.
So as a Canadian, I'll build on that and be careful. But as a guest here in Washington and as someone who lived in the U.S. for 3 years, studied U.S. politics for many years, and lived here in the United States at an interesting time in U.S. financial and political history from 2007 to 2010. So for industries like mine, that was a particularly interesting time. I think layered on top of that, one of the challenges is in this area, people are craving some degree of simplicity, right? So while it's a plan for a plan, people can look at the 10-part plan of a digital charter and kind of get their head around what's going to be in and not, and then, the proof's going to be in the pudding. The challenge often, with respect, with this political system is that it's death by amendment, right? And so if you look at, and I just mentioned 2007, 2010, so financial system crisis in the United States. Out of that comes the Dodd-Frank bill, which is tens of thousands of pages long. And again, in its genesis, legislation that is trying to ensure that the United States never faces a financial crisis like that again, ever, and really targeted ideally at the too big to fail and moral, big moral issues. What ends up happening is in order to make that sausage in the factory, amendments get added, including things like regulating the cost of interchange when you swipe your debit or credit card. Now, how that has anything to do with what caused the financial crisis in the United States during that era is beyond me. But what ends up happening is you get this, in order to get the legislation moved forward, you have to compromise, and add, and before you know it, you've inserted enormous complexity at a time when you're trying to drive some degree of simplicity. So I think, with respect, I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges in this space for this country.
You see the National Defense Authorization Acts are basically the only legislation that passes in the U.S. anymore. So defense authorizations somehow have literally every other piece of policy Congress was debating in that session tacked onto it.
Jason?
How do you backslide sidewalk labs? So my name's Jason Myers. I have a background in trade. This discussion sounds a lot like trade. It starts out as a very simple thing, it becomes increasingly complex, trade, and then at the end you get the people who are sort of technically minded tend to support the outcomes, and those who may not take such a technical approach to the issue become more suspicious of it. And then that kind of goes off on its own tangent. And I feel like the sidewalk labs has been like this, and the regulation of data and tech is a similar sort of dynamic, which is, so there was this piece in this magazine in Toronto Life, and in it there were the pros and cons. And if you look at the pro side, very much out of sort of the tech playbook, it also reminds me of the energy sector, other areas where it's the industries that are driven largely by engineers, accountants, lawyers, people with sort of technical training, and the sort of advocacy is being directed towards the establishment. People like, people who are sort of well-established and prosperous. And then you look at the people who are not as sort of technologically oriented, sometimes counselors, it could be artists, it could be other types of things, and then they tend to resist this. And I think this is a problem that tech has. It doesn't have a good ability to talk to broad populations, and it doesn't do itself much favor because it really isolates a lot of people who may not be familiar with the context. My question is, with regards to all this regulation and sort of, these policies to ensure that companies use data properly, how effective do you think this is? Because I look at things like anti-spam legislation in Canada. It strikes me that companies many of these are ignoring because they think they're either not going to get caught, or if they do get caught, it's worth paying the penalty. Maybe thoughts on that?
And that was a question that if you were watching on the video, you wouldn't have caught all of that. But there were quite a couple of good pieces in there, one of which I'll paraphrase as kind of the difficulty of tech people who often will look and say, yeah, that makes sense to me, to be influencers of the general public, which kind of, if they don't understand, would prefer to sort of be wary and suspicious. So how do you manage that dialogue? And then the second question, has government earned the trust by being effective in little things like anti-spam or other measures they've taken that will sustain them to making more ambitious decisions on the basis of the charter? Anyone on either of those?
Well, I'll jump in a little bit. I think you've hit the nail on the head to a certain degree. When we work, banks partner with fintech and big tech is increasingly, and part of the journey we've had with them is helping them to try to overcome some of those obstacles. So I've been in meetings where people are talking about things like the cloud and moving services to the cloud, which if you're sort of a digital native, seems quite intuitive, right? Like, I get it. There's a digital cloud. It's not a server bank. Okay, understood. But they face questions, and I can see the look of exasperation on the executives' faces from these tech companies when they're asked questions like this. So this cloud, this will be a proprietary cloud for this bank, right? And it's like, no, by the very nature, that's not the way a cloud works, right? But you feel for the senators that were asking questions of social media executives, and you sort of feel like you get a sense of what the Genius Bar at a Georgetown Apple store would feel like. But we've taken certain things for granted now. So when we use internet banking or mobile banking, it doesn't occur to us that this is bank A has a proprietary direct line of service to conduct my banking. So cloud's very much the same. There's no Bank of America internet. There's no Citibank internet. We're okay with that because we've used that now for about 20 years. But when you start introducing concepts like the cloud and saying, your data is going to be housed there, or portions of it, and some of that might be in the United States and some of that might be in India, you can sense the tension and sort of the visceral reaction, that the temperature is kind of rising. And I think at times technology executives have a tendency to just blow right through that, right? And I think later they end up really facing lots of resistance. So what we're trying to do more and more on sort of these newer concepts is to avoid kind of the Terminator kind of interpretations, is say, how you frame these things is just as important as the concept. And I think at times that can be applied somewhat inconsistently.
I would say there's a question of how much people actually want to know. And one thing, I think we need a cadre of really technically savvy policymakers who can focus a lot of their attention on technology. If you visit the Hill for 5 minutes, I think you quickly give up hope that we'll get to the point where all of our political leaders will be technically knowledgeable enough to make intelligent decisions about technology policy. But I think we do need that cadre. But then the question is, how do you communicate the reasons why these policies make sense to the public, who are never going to be at the point where, like, even to the extent that Facebook is actually somewhat transparent about the way that they manage their back end for certain things, people don't want to try to understand it, and they probably never will. But I think the reason I say this is, you sometimes get into these really interesting situations where a policy is proposed that intuitively seems to make sense, but the reason that the technologists are pushing back is because they know that it won't actually work the way that it's intended. So take, for example, with some of the privacy legislation that requires users to be notified of all data that is collected on them. One of Facebook's pushbacks on those provisions in GDPR was that the way Facebook had managed their back end, for example, the data that they collected for websites so that they could, send messages to their users, they created separate lists which weren't linked together, that allowed, if you were a website, you could identify, a certain set of users that you wanted to communicate with, but none of it was linked to your actual Facebook profile. And so they attempted to point out to policymakers in the EU that in order to comply with GDPR, they were going to have to take all of this data that was out there that was not searchable, that could not be consolidated within Facebook, the way that the system was designed, and link it back to your individual profile. And so any malicious actor that got into their back end would suddenly, instead of having to go around and basically check on each individual list whether your unique identifiers were on it, now they would have a list of all of the lists that you were on. All right? Is that actually privacy positive for you? And I say this with the caveat that I have my huge skepticisms about the way that Facebook manages data, and I think that actually giving users that transparency and control has been very important. But I think that's the kind of divergence. From a technical person's perspective, that's privacy negative. Even if it gives users control, it's creating a single point of failure where all of their data can be compromised. And so there's always going to be that kind of difference in both the way that technical people look at some of these questions, but also the things that seem intuitively to make sense might require a great degree of technical sophistication to understand their challenges.
I'd say just briefly, the concern about framing all of this technocratically is that it's no longer the way that big tech frames it, and it's really no longer the way that policymakers frame it. Policymakers don't need to understand Facebook's backend to have concerns around facial recognition. They don't even really need to understand how facial recognition works. As tech becomes increasingly powerful and plays a larger role in society, it runs up against a lot of basics. So last week, California passed a law that would classify app-based workers like Uber drivers as employees. Uber says we won't abide by that. That has very little to do with tech, right? It has to do with industrial policy. It has to do with labor relations. And both the Wall Street Journal's editorial board and the Financial Times editorial board come out against that. The reason why so many tech companies are facing internal employee revolts has very little to do with the technocratic element of it. It has to do with working with ICE. It has to do with working with the military. It has to do with HR policies, with sexual violence. And as these companies become increasingly powerful, I worry I'm not convinced how much it matters that a senator or a member of parliament doesn't understand the specifics. If they're going to pass a legislation breaking up big tech, it doesn't matter what they understand. They still have that power. But
it matters if you want the policy to be a good policy, and it depends a lot on the issue.
If Elizabeth Warren wins and breaks up Google, I think Google will care very little how many of her staffers understand how the search works.
That's true, but if we say whoever wins should make the best policy about big tech and about competition in technology, having some understanding of how the businesses work and how the technology works is very important to identifying what is actually the best policy for consumers and the economy and the public.
The debate is so far past that, right? Like the debate in the OECD is it's between India and Brazil and the US, and India doesn't have technocratic concerns. India has national security concerns. They want to have a functioning economy. They're pushing back against Amazon and Walmart. It has nothing to do with a differing opinion between two junior staffers over how to define, I don't know, search dominance. But anyway.
I have a question in the front. I can't resist. Louisa Savage.
I think you raised a really important question, and I've heard about the lack of technical knowledge. I've heard different proposals to remedy this. One of them was setting up a series of, we did this in the healthcare sphere in the past, a series of basically funded fellowships to send technologists going for control of society. And I wonder what you've seen elsewhere that has worked in this regard, regardless of whether the questions are
And for those of you who are watching this video, the question relates to tech fellows working with Congress. This is a model we've seen in other sectors, healthcare and so on, where you bring experts into the congressional offices to help bridge the tech divide. A little more effective than bring your grandchildren to work day, but panel, what do you think?
I think from a Canadian perspective right now, we're seeing the private sector actually beginning to take a leadership role in terms of educating members of the government. So from digital modernization to cloud first policy towards cloud native, it's in these companies' best interests to have an educated person to have a discussion with. If you can't really talk about the benefits of a smart cloud policy if they don't understand cloud. So right, you have to build that foundation. So I think in Canada now we're seeing a realization to push from the private sector that it's in their best interest to help speed up this learning curve, to help policymakers better understand this, and then for them it has the added benefit to once they understand it, they can move forward with a procurement process or with a policy decision.
The United Kingdom has invested quite a bit on the public service side of training both political staffers at the same time that they're training public servants. Canada's adopted, so the Canada School of Public Service has adopted the UK model. It's similar. They're bringing in experts. They're holding special classes. They realize it's a real issue. Estonia is always good, but it's hard to scale.
There are these fellowships. There are many of them, and they've been pretty. I think they've been pretty effective. One thing I would add to what I said a minute ago is we shouldn't be trying to educate the politicians. I think their depth of knowledge on any of the issues that they cover is relatively limited. What matters is that they're well staffed. The staff's the ones who can dive into these issues and come up with policy ideas. And so giving them access to staff that actually has some credible capability. Agree on the UK model as well has been somewhat effective. Other countries are also developing ministries of science and technology or dedicated ministries or agencies dedicated to specific tech policy issues, and then providing pretty significant access to the technical experts within those ministries and agencies for their political leadership. That's another piece that I think has a lot of value and is something that we're trying to do in the U.S. And then finally, I would say for a lot of the executive branch agencies, one of the big things that progress has been made on in recent years is creating job categories for people with technical expertise, creating opportunities for them to earn competitive salaries to what they would earn in the private sector, creating retention incentives and opportunities for them to re-enter government after spending time in the private sector. It's something that DoD is doing a lot of. It's something that DHS is doing. It's something the Department of Commerce is doing. So.
One last thing very briefly. This is only 6 months old, but Canada, in an attempt to bring in smart tech talent, has negotiated a détente with its biggest union so that people can come in at a higher salary level. One of the biggest problems for bringing technically literate people is if you've got 5 years of experience, you don't want to start at the bottom of a classification scale and work your way up the union. So the deal is that these people will leave, but they'll come in for 2, 3, 5 years, and you can attract better people if you pay them more money. I mean, it's 6 months old. We'll see if it works.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was a brief discussion of being privacy positive, a phrase I quite like. I'm break positive. So we've come to the end of time. I hope you'll join me in thanking them for an absolutely fantastic panel.
Thank you.
We'll reconvene in about 10 minutes to start at 10:45, the second panel. Thanks very much.
Thank
Thank you for that. That was great. You were great. It was quite good.
Thank you.
we'll sort of pull everybody this
You want me
way.
to sit here?
Yeah, that's where I moderated from before. It doesn't really matter. Or that can work, and I'll just
Sit here.
push. Rick, just push my junk to the far corner. That's fine. Make better video. This is like one of those break the fourth wall. We're all having a conversation, and I wanted to bring everybody back into it so that we could convene our second panel. For those of you who were not here on the first panel, my name is Christopher Sands, and I am a professor and director of the Center for Canadian Studies here at Johns Hopkins University's NITS School of Advanced International Studies, SICE as we call it. And it is a pleasure again to welcome you to this panel, which differs from our previous panel in that this is where we really will focus on the Canadian election and Canada's preparations to address something that's a hot topic here in Washington, fake news. Someone around here keeps tweeting about it. Everyone keeps accusing each other of it. But Canada's trying to address this vulnerability that all of our democracies around the world face, which is unfair voter influence and disinformation. Happily, you will not have me moderating this panel, but we will have Louisa Savage. Louisa Savage is a longtime award-winning journalist who has covered Washington for Canadian periodicals and is now an executive director at Politico. One of her passion projects is Politico Pro Canada, where she has brought a level of political coverage that we've become accustomed to. The standards are rising very much here in Washington to the Canadian scene, but it's part of Politico's very global approach that tries to get out of the sort of U.S. hidebound, navel-gazing world to really internationalize production. She's moderating a panel that includes one of her colleagues from the vast Politico empire, Mike Farrell. Mike's a cybersecurity reporter who has a tech beat, has covered these issues at a high level of technical skill, but also with policy acuity. He's got a good sense of where the vulnerabilities are, and if you enjoyed some of what we talked about in the last panel, I think you'll find this one particularly useful, and Mike's great to have on the panel. And then we have Rick Roth, who is with Global Public Affairs. He is a recovering political staffer, possibly a once and future political staffer, who worked with John Baird, Canada's foreign minister, in helping to address some of the challenges of foreign influence on elections during the Harper government. He's been involved with Ontario politics as well. We've seen a lot in recent years coming from both Ottawa and Queen's Park, and he has his finger on the pulse of that. Bringing also another aspect to this, which I think is useful, which is how does it look from inside the party structure? How do politicians view these kinds of interventions? And then last but not least, I'll be on the panel, but you've heard enough from me. Let me turn it over to Louisa.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for joining us, and thank you to all those joining on the live stream. As Chris mentioned, I'm Louisa Savage, and one of the things I do is oversee and build Politico Pro Canada, which is a subscription service focused on the Canada-U.S. relationship and starting this fall on Canadian domestic policy as well. It's one of 16 policy verticals that we have at Politico, including newly launched Politico Pro Cannabis that launched this month. And I'm going to give Mike a promotion here. He's actually the editor of Politico Pro Cybersecurity, and so he runs a team of reporters dedicated to covering cybersecurity at Politico. So we're thrilled to be a part of this conversation as we're trying to really elevate the conversation around binational issues between the United States and Canada, both for our subscribers in Canada and here in the U.S. and abroad. This obviously election security, foreign meddling, huge issue in pretty much every democracy around the world. So it behooves us all to understand what we're all doing, how it compares, and what lessons we can learn from each other. We obviously have a Canadian election coming up October 21st, and then we have a U.S. election next November. So these two conversations happening simultaneously in both countries, and I think it's great of Chris to bring us together and see where those conversations intersect and where they don't. So I'm going to cast Chris today in the role of Canada expert and have him fill us in on the details of new Canadian policies that have been brought in. But before we do that, I wanted to kick off with Mike because I wanted him just to set the table for us very briefly as to what we learned about election interference and election meddling in 2016, and then what has the United States government done in response. And I think from there, we can then talk about what the Canadian government is doing and how it is or is not different. So Mike, why don't you just walk us through, there's a lot of noise around what happened in 26, but just walk us through incisively exactly what happened and what the policy response has been in Washington.
Sure. Thanks so much, Louisa. And thanks for that promotion.
You're welcome.
I expect many more after this. So thanks to you guys for sticking around as well. I think like as Louisa mentioned, it was 2016 and the U.S. election that we really saw the scope of Russian interference and the massive concerted efforts to really influence an election. And we're 3 years later, we're still really trying to figure out all the parts and pieces of that campaign. I mean, tomorrow the Federal Election Commission is holding a disinformation day-long discussion, and they've ordered tech companies to come. So they're still trying to wrap their heads around what happened. But I mean, a lot of things have happened as a result, and a lot of change has taken place. It's sometimes difficult to recognize the change because this issue has also become highly politicized. Trump tweets daily about the fake news media, that the witch hunt that the Mueller investigation was. But if you do put some of that aside, somewhat ironically, his administration is taking a lot of very proactive steps to work against Russian disinformation, election meddling in other ways, such as vulnerabilities in election systems. So, I mean, if you think back to the initial intelligence report that came out, sort of outlining and really detailing what the scope of the Russian campaign was, you have seen, concrete government actions as a result of that, right? There were charges against GRU officers and the Internet Research Agency, which is the troll farm that carried out and organized and created a lot of the campaigns that were spread throughout Facebook and Instagram, YouTube videos and such. There have been sanctions against Russians. There have been everything. In fact, there was, the thought was, as we were learning all of this, like the big concern was, well, what was going to happen with the midterms? So there was a great deal of attention focused by Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Cyber Command, to try to thwart any attempts to disrupt the midterms. And afterwards, we did see actions by the Russian agents to spread, disinformation via social media around the midterms. So, I mean, I think that, not to say we've got this problem figured out. I think we're a long ways from doing that. There hasn't been this whole of government strategy. There's been legislation such as the Honest Ads Act that have been proposed but have kind of been stuck in committee. I think because on one hand, there's a lot of concern within agencies and policymakers about this issue. Because it's been so politicized, you see a lack of action from a legislative point of view.
So if you look across all the discussion since 2016, can you point to any specific steps that are going to be different in the next election? Anything different from what we had in 2016? I understand we went back and prosecuted people who were involved in 2016, named them, et cetera. But what are any defensive steps that are being taken ahead of 2020?
Sure. I mean, I think that the fact that we're looking for it is a big change to begin with. And the social media companies, again, they are on one hand saying they are doing more, and on the other hand, sort of pushing against regulation. They are taking steps to sort of rid their systems of troll accounts that, and that we know had been established long before the 2016 elections in anticipation of being able to carry out operations, spread false narratives sort of create chaos and discord among minority groups. If you look at what happened with offensive operations from the military point of view, the Cyber Command actually took action around the midterms to shut internet access off to the IRA. So I very much expect something like that happening ahead of 2020. I mean, you also had kind of these task force that involved members of the FBI, DHS, the social media companies, the other members of the intelligence community, sort of manning the phones, if you will, on election night to sort of see what sort of problems there were. So those things will exist around 2020 as well.
Where would you say within the U.S. government apparatus, where is the leadership? Is there someone who is really leading the charge here? Is it coming out of Cyber Command? Is it coming out of DHS, the Pentagon? How does that look?
Well, you do have a relatively new cybersecurity agency within DHS that is taking somewhat of the lead and reaching out, especially with industry. Last week, I think it was, you had a contingent of government government officials meeting in Silicon Valley with Google, Facebook, and others to sort of, continue pressing the platforms to do more. But you're also getting a lot of pushback on the government. Like if the companies are saying, well, if you want us to do more, we need to know more of what you know, because oftentimes the platforms are often in the dark about who are the operators, who are the fake operators, taking advantage of their systems, which are designed to be open and frictionless and create opportunities to spread information and share things. So there's, I would say the leadership is coming from DHS. In the domestic front, it's coming from Cyber Command and NSA on the international front.
Okay. Before we move to Chris to explain the Canadian policy, I wanted to ask Rick just to jump in and help us just set the scene, particularly for those in the audience who maybe aren't from Canada. You were a senior aide in a previous life to Canada's Foreign Minister, John Baird, under a previous government. Just who wants to meddle in the Canadian elections and why? Just very briefly, just set the scene before we go to the remedy.
Yeah, great question. I mean, Canada doesn't have a lot of international foes, so to speak. There's obviously some trade tensions with China that the Americans are involved with. So obviously, I think the Chinese probably have some skin in the game. Canada's been a pretty vocal critic of Russian intervention in Ukraine. But it's pretty bipartisan, and shouldn't necessarily they wouldn't have as much skin in the game as they did probably in the presidential election.
Mm-hmm. So there's not a sense that Russia has a preferred outcome in the Canadian election.
No, actually, so the leader of the Conservative Party is actually banned from entering Russia, as well as I guess the foreign minister as well from the Liberal Party. So it's pretty across the board disdain from Russia to Canadian politicians.
So what is the real fear here that requires a policy response?
Yeah, I think I think a lot of people were caught off guard with what happened in the United States, and I think Canada just saw this as an opportunity to kind of get ahead of any sort of intervention. I don't think that there's necessarily a real threat, but to say that there's no threat is probably underestimating it.
Mm-hmm. And I guess another issue that would be at stake more broadly is just the reputation and success of democracy.
Yeah,
writ
absolutely.
large, right?
And
if
look,
you can mess with democracy in any country,
Yeah.
it makes them all look bad.
And I mean, at the end of the day, democratic countries for a long time have been, they wouldn't call them disinformation campaigns. We would have called them information campaigns. But using technology to penetrate firewalls in Iran, the State Department ran a similar campaign to the government of Canada that I was a part of at the time, and it was to kind of talk to Iranian citizens, what their issues were, what they wanted to see from their new president, and this is after Ahmadinejad left government. So same sort of campaigns were run in Ukraine. We supported kind of pro-democracy movements where they would drop leaflets from airplanes into kind of remote areas, again to kind of provide information. So to say we call Russian disinformation, and it's when it's democratic, it's kind of information.
Well, maybe when it's just fact-based.
Yeah, no,
information.
absolutely.
I would draw that distinction maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, there's competing sides, and there was, I heard a story one time during the transition from Bush to Obama, State Department officials or national security advisors were kind of advising what they were doing around the world. And Obama's, quick quip back was, we need to be careful that this, they could turn this technology around on us. And they did, and it seemed somewhat prescient in his views.
Okay. Well, great. So, Chris, we wrote about Canada's new policies at Politico, and our Canada reporter, our amazing Canada reporter, Alex Panetta, and our tech reporter in Brussels wrote about this policy together, and they wrote, and I quote, Canada spent the last 3 years developing the most detailed plan anywhere in the Western world to combat foreign meddling in its upcoming election. But with the country's national campaign to begin in a matter of weeks, one question remains, will the efforts pay off? So I'm hoping we can shed a little light on that. So can you walk us through what the Canadian government has announced with regard to its policy on election meddling?
Sure, and to pick up on something that Rick mentioned, it's important to contextualize this beginning with 2015, because in the Canadian election in 2015, there was a lot of discussion about democratic reform. And this was an issue that Justin Trudeau and the Liberals used to try to argue that they were more in favor of inclusion, that they wanted to be interested in things like proportional representation, new voices in politics, and transparency, all sort of issues tied up in this question of election reform. And after the election, Justin Trudeau, as Prime Minister, appointed a Minister for Democratic Institutions to try to look at reform. And that's the trajectory we're at in 2015 going into 2016. The U.S. election, very much as Mike said, it really threw that off because it suddenly got a lot of Canadians worried about the security and integrity of elections before they were worried about experimenting with proportional representation and other methods. The government itself responded by asking the Communications Security Establishment, which is Canada's equivalent of the National Security Agency, to do a review of what the threats to Canada might be. And I don't know, Rick, if you have a sideline working for them, but it was very similar to what you said, which is there's no specific evidence. They offered nothing that said Canada had been a target or was a target, but they talked about the experiences of other major democracies and said we'd be foolish not to be prepared. You said it better, but that was essentially the argument. And they in particular focused on two case studies. That was the U.S. election in 2016, which they argued, I thought very deftly in that report, that it wasn't so much the outcome. They weren't questioning whether Trump was elected or any of those questions, but the loss of legitimacy and the loss of confidence in the system as being something that would be that Canada was vulnerable to as well. The other example they looked at was the Brexit referendum and Britain's experience, where the British intelligence was worried that there had been some interference and some misinformation, disinformation. Largely, they focused on Russia in that campaign. And of course, it was a very close, I think for Canadians who've had a couple referenda on Quebec's role in the country, they know how close referenda can be. And the idea of just, even if you're moving fractions of percentage points, this really focused Canada's minds on the importance of keeping the system well protected. That led to a rapid debate about what could be done. I'm going to fast forward only to say that most of what happened in Canada literally happened in 2018. There was some initial activity in the spring, in April and May. There was in May of 2016, there was a bill introduced, the Elections Modernization Act. It ultimately gets passed at the end of the year, in December of 2018, and that was almost the last minute that you would need to have this in place in order to have agencies make changes so that it could be implemented in the 2019 election coming up in a few weeks. And that's important too. This was a hurry-up effort on an issue where people hadn't quite defined the threats, and so they really stayed almost, as we talked about in the previous panel, at the level of digital charter. There are some things here which are clearly promissory notes, works in progress, plans of things to come. So a couple of big pieces from the Election Modernization Act. The new act requires that platforms keep advertising records. And this is similar to something we've seen DHS do with regard to people movement, something that you can go back forensically and figure out, well, these were all the ads. The concern here was micro-targeting, that maybe overall political parties or some group might have an ad campaign that looks good to the public, but they're micro-targeting perhaps to push messages that are more negative, like hateful messages or base motivating messages. It could be disinformation. So they want the platforms to keep those records so that they're auditable afterwards. Also, the platforms are prohibited by law from selling political advertising to any non-Canadian entity. This was meant to prevent Russian bots or any from outside the country from being able to buy ads on Facebook or intervene. Some question as to how well the platforms are going to be able to implement that and whether they will actually know who they're selling to. But at least that's the intent. Also, in order to protect the voter records and make sure that there was something against which they could check, Bill C-76, the Election Modernization Act, also creates a pre-registry of voters. So you vote in Canada at 18, like you would in the United States, but there's a registry being set up for 14 to 17-year-olds that establish some of their information prior to their being able to vote so that they are in the system. So that way it will be easier to pick up fraud, which often occurs at the beginning of the electoral rolls where they're new voters anyway, and so perhaps that's where you could have some gap. They've also reintroduced something, which is interesting in an American context, voter ID cards with barcodes, both to streamline getting people ready to make their vote, but also because they wanted to have a more solid form of ID for Canadians so that it was harder to hack, not just an electronic voter roll that could be intervened with, but something with a hard card.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we should probably establish, this is all being done at the federal level.
Right.
Because it's a federal...
You're quite right. So for a long time, there is this entity, Elections Canada, that is federal. For a long time, the provinces had their own voter rolls, and there were, this was a local election administration really mattered. But now, Canada's Election Canada unit now covers the whole country. There's a single voter roll, and so many of these things are national now. It's a huge difference from the way the U.S., which has a very decentralized voter election administration structure, similar to what Canada used to have, although even more at the county level sometimes. Canada's been able to do this all very naturally and nationally. And there's one other thing I would just mention because I think it's an important development. There's long been a system in Canada of vouching where you could go and say, look, this guy's my neighbor, or look, I know this lady, she lives on my block. And they take a record of that and they'll allow you to vote, even if you didn't have ID or you just moved in. That personal vouching has been reintroduced into the system as a sort of no-tech, not even low-tech, way of making sure that people aren't denied the right to vote on the day they show up because of a screw-up in records. Some of the criticism, and we, those of you who follow this, we advertised we'd get Ed Greenspan here, and we're a good friend of all of ours from the Public Policy Forum in Canada, and they've kind of identified one of the big problems here, which is there are 3 levels at which the Election Modernization Act might have been hoped to address challenges. Political parties, because they're big actors, they collect a lot of data, they crunch a lot of numbers. What are people's privacy rights to that data and how might it be manipulated? Secondly, the election administration piece, and thirdly, voters themselves. And the criticism that Ed's group has come up with, he wrote a big paper with Taylor Owen from the University of British Columbia, and their criticism was that the focus has been too much on election administration, that there's a little bit on voters, and there's almost nothing to control political parties, which they see as the weakness of the approach. They've also said, the emphasis of the Election Modernization Act is very much on the demand side, the voters, the participants in the system, but not so much on the supply side. These are the people who are actually putting the disinformation into the system. They want more regulation of political speech. Now, that's something that would be very different in the U.S. People would object to it, but it sort of gives you a sense of where people are feeling the shortcomings of this legislation have been.
I was hoping you could also speak to one other aspect of Canada's response, which is something called the Critical Election Incidents Public Protocol. I don't even think there's like a good acronym for that. But this is the notion that there will be I understand, a 5-person team of non-partisan public servants led by the clerk of the Privy Council, which for Americans, it's the best analog I can think of would be like a White House chief of staff figure sort of running the policy arm of the government. and also the national security advisor to the prime minister. They're running this 5-person group, and they're supposed to use the intelligence services and alert the public when there's a threat. How is that going to work? This is something that presumably intelligence services could do. We know that the FBI director, James Comey, here wanted to alert the public about Russian interference, and then the president, President Obama, said no at the time. Lot of fears of politicizing things. How can that actually work in practice?
Well, I think you're right to raise it. So the Critical Election Incident Public Protocol is very much in the promissory note aspect, I think, of Canada's approach. They needed something in place now for the election coming up. They went to the non-political, professional part of the civil service to get people who would hopefully retain public confidence and are not tied to a political party. Those of you who are familiar with the British system know that there are certain things that civil servants can do while the government's in an writ period. They're not supposed to make any major decisions, but they are supposed to keep the lights on and do certain basic things. So it's very much in that parliamentary government context. So you have the clerk of the Privy Council, you have the National Security Advisor and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister, you have the Deputy Minister of Justice, also the Deputy Attorney General, usually the same person, the Deputy Minister of Public Safety, the equivalent of DHS in Canada, and then the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. And their mandate is sort of, to borrow from DHS, if you see something, say something. That they're supposed to raise a flag if they see something that's clearly false or if they become aware of a hacking operation. That design, and I thought it was interesting you brought up James Comey, was really designed to make sure there wasn't a James Comey moment where an individual is grappling with what do I do because I think there's a problem. Now the clear guidance is you take it to this group. If this group agrees, they will raise it in public, and that's the expectation, not that it will be shunted off to the side. But it still has some of the Comey dilemma, because what if you have something you don't think it's good, but you're not 100% sure, and the vote is coming up in a few days? It puts tremendous pressure on these individuals to make a call. Insofar as they don't make a call and everybody thinks the election's fine, the credibility, the performance legitimacy of this mechanism will go. But to the extent that this is tested by a shock, I think right now it's a very thin layer of protection. It's the kind of thing that could easily make a bad call and therefore delegitimize this approach and send Canada back to the drawing board, because it doesn't really have a lot of worked out principles. I'll give you another example, not to pick on the Harper government. Canada worried a little bit during the Harper government about having a national security review of foreign direct investment, and set up a mechanism to do those reviews in response to some big foreign investments in Canada, including by the Chinese, Nexen, the oil company. But it was a fairly opaque process that seemed to have a sort of political fudge factor in it. And so it didn't necessarily build up confidence among foreign investors and others that, yes, this is a system that is as good as, for example, the CFIUS system, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which is operated here by Treasury. Now, that's partly because the CFIUS system has a longer track record and more people know about it. Here, I think that the vehicle looks impressive, and it needs some road testing miles on it before people will have confidence in it, but they're clearly reacting to what's been happening all over the world, and particularly what's been happening here.
And some of the things that the principles around this are quite broad. It says some of the facts as laid before them. Will this undermine the credibility of the Canadian election? Asking civil servants to come to a position, 5 civil servants to come to a position that if this is going to undermine a Canadian election, I find it could be difficult for them to come to any sort of consensus. And I also have to say, any sort of national security advisor, even civil servants and deputy ministers are very cautious about communicating, and would, you're basically asking them to intervene during an election period, to raise red flags, but not necessarily to have any kind of fixes. Any sort of national security advisor would also probably want to, if they have information or if they've been tipped off, wouldn't necessarily want to raise the red flags, because think of, they could probably get more information kind of the longer they wait. So there's a ton of factors, as Chris said, that I think, need some road testing before it's figured out.
Great.
Yeah,
Well,
I
go ahead, Mark.
was going to say, I think one of the issues you're touching on is like when to communicate that there's evidence of a disinformation campaign or a hacking campaign is certainly something that is everyone in the U.S. who deals with this is thinking about as well. I mean, I think even though they're around the midterms, right, there are these war rooms focusing and looking at disinformation campaigns or any anomalies they were seeing on social media. I think they were very quiet and very careful about what they said during the election period because, I mean, the one thing that we know that the people carrying out these operations want to do, it's not necessarily that they just want to support one candidate, right? They want to discredit the entire process, right? So if there's one way that you could feed into what they're trying to do by, talking about it, or like, so, if you say, well, there's, a disinformation campaign that the Russians are carrying out to support, this one candidate, then, all of a sudden you have people saying, well, I'm not going to go vote for that person, or, I'm going to stay home because the whole system's rigged anyway. So, I mean, I think that's a really interesting dilemma about how it's one thing to spot these problems and, develop the technology and the manpower and the policies to do that. But there's another whole dynamic about how you talk about them to make sure that you don't, further, or make people distrust the system even more.
Mm-hmm. Now, I would love to bring in the audience. So as you think about your questions, please raise your hand and I'll come to you. But I think that one of the questions that comes up from everything you're saying is anything that the government can do is pretty much retrospective, right? The information is out there. The fake ads or tweets or Facebook posts, whatever, will have already been created and disseminated. The people in the best position to sort of act most quickly, obviously, are the platforms. Mike, can you talk a little bit about the perspective of the platforms? And I understand from my reading that Google has pulled out of accepting any political ads in Canada ahead of the election because they thought the rules were too complicated. What is generally the position of the platforms on what they think they can do and what they don't want to be regulated into doing?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think you've heard Mark Zuckerberg actually come out and say he wants some regulation in this space, but I think on the other hand, you see lobbying money going against particular regulation. The Honest Ads Act, which was I think a Klobuchar Warren bill, is kind of sort of languished in committee. I think you see.
And what would that have done?
That would have forced transparency in any political advertising on social media. So who paid for it, where it came from, that sort of thing. Sort of similar to what you see in traditional print advertising. The platforms would have to abide by something like that too. Now they are taking steps on their own to have the repositories of advertisements and force more buyers of these ads to provide more information. But you're right. I mean, all of this is happening so quickly in real time. I mean, you can imagine a deep fake video of a candidate goes viral a day before the election and the damage will have been done, right? So you could forget about, I mean, it'd be great to see who did that and why they did it, but that's going to happen weeks, months after an election. So I think the platforms are, on one hand, trying to stay out in front of regulators. I'm sure they're thinking not just about what's happening in the U.S. with increased pressure on them. I think they do understand the political dynamic that Congress is unlikely to act on anything in this space during this administration. The next administration may be the same, depending on if it's Trump or not. But so I think they know that, but still they are trying to do more. They're trying to do more for their customer base, but they're also trying to do more because they see things that are happening in Europe, things that are happening in Canada, because every Western democracy is confronted with this issue. Mm-hmm. And again, I think you will see more from the platforms. One interesting other thing that Google is doing is they're trying to, within their search, prioritize original journalism. So as opposed to surfacing repurposed or repackaged or questionable news sources, trying to prioritize and identify illegitimate
credible sources. I think you see similar things happening at Facebook as well. So.
Well, Rick, you're no longer actively in politics, but you were a senior aide at both the federal and the provincial level. How does this look to your friends who are still in politics within the parties? What is the particularly, this is a Trudeau Liberal government initiative. How are the Conservatives seeing it?
Yeah. So I think it'll be interesting to see this election how what kind of means the political parties use to kind of reach voters. I think the last election was probably one of the first in Canada where social media was really utilized. Trudeau's folks learned a lot from the Clinton and Obama administrations on how to kind of reach voters. I think that the micro-targeting or the amount of micro-targeting that you could do in Twitter and Facebook kind of gave an upper hand to Conservatives, I think, if they did it well. I think their base and their core kind of vote is spread out in probably much more rural areas where Liberals are kind of tentatively larger municipalities, larger centers, and I think that voters are probably easier to reach. So I'd be interested to see, one of the campaign managers for the Conservatives said that, they were kind of ignoring Twitter, they were ignoring Facebook, they were ignoring kind of the digital ads and trying to go directly to voters to kind of build up support for a ground game around Election Day. So it'll be interesting to see. I also think, one of the other issues that I think is kind of paying itself out for the first time in federal politics is the third-party advertisers and the role that they kind of play as kind of pseudo PACs. So this is Canada's kind of first foray into that. The provincial in Ontario, they've been very successful in re-electing Liberal governments, and I think over the last kind of 2 years, 3 years, there's been a resurgence in a brand called Ontario Proud, and they've now made it Canada Proud, and it's a big kind of digital operation that is focused solely on kind of bringing down liberal ideas and liberal politicians.
I should add, this is one of the interesting things about this election. Canada's moved to fixed elections, so we have a date usually well in advance. You can still have the government collapse, vote of confidence, but generally, you're going to have an election in 4 years. The date's predictable in advance. One of the dilemmas that came along with that is that campaign finance restrictions and regulation of a lot of advertising really only ran from the writ period when the election is called to the day of the election, and yet parties could actually spend unrestricted monies prior to the drop of the writ. The Election Modernization Act created a sort of 6 month from June until the fixed election date in the same year, dead period where the campaign finance regulations would apply. We're testing that now. We've just had that, and it does affect the ability of parties to prepare the ground. I think one of the other things that's interesting here is the role the voters have in being willing consumers of information that may be false. So certainly you see this with people who really hate one side or the other, and they'll believe anything that comes up. The American experience with this is with Donald Trump. And so you wouldn't even have to be very clever to come up with a Donald Trump comment that sounds like, I love that Justin Trudeau, that if it goes out the night before the election, people say, oh, hey, Trump really wants Trudeau to win. Let's vote Conservative. Or, just those kind of mind-messing things that get people riled up because they're no longer trusting and participating in mainstream media as much, so they find niche media that confirms their biases, and that's a breeding ground for micro-targeting where they'll just be very quickly picking it up. And the ability of this critical election incident team to be able to sort of be in those nooks and crannies of the internet that are where influence is happening, and to be able to counter stuff is still vulnerable. I'll give you another example of one that we're wrestling with here. There's this kind of amusing, I think, but I'm amused by these things, war between a site called Snopes that does fact-checking and a site called the Babylon Bee, which is a sort of conservative satire site, where Snopes will do a story saying, this satire is all wrong. Here, we're going to fact-check this. But it's a satire. So Babylon Bee then goes back and attacks Snopes for not really being a fact-checking site, but being another satire site. And the reason that battle is so fierce is because people are worried about being deplatformed by being perceived as a disinformation source from Facebook and Twitter and other things. So there's real equities in this in the non-political party space as well, and the dynamics of people's consumption of information, false or otherwise, are still moving pretty fast, I think.
And third parties have been searching for a long time in Canada on how to be effective during campaigns. We got rid of corporate and union donations in, I want to say 2006, 2008. So that's why the ability of big PACs to roll out massive ad campaigns just hasn't happened in Canada. Which is, as third parties kind of move to the digital space, it's very, very inexpensive, very cheap to reach the amount of voters that you would normally have to spend a lot of money to get to.
And Rick, what I was trying to get at with my question, and I wonder your thoughts on this, is what do conservative parties think about this particular setup that the Liberal government has come up with? Are they concerned that it could be somehow used against their interests in the campaign, or are they glad that it's happening because this meddling could go either way and cause problems for everybody?
Yeah.
Or do they have an alternative set of policies they would have preferred to see countering disinformation?
I didn't track the kind of transition of Bill 76 that much. I've heard Liberal politicians that would probably be on the more progressive side of the party speak out in favor of this, speak out in favor of the command. I think Conservatives are probably hanging back, obviously weary of this being kind of used against them close to the election. But the one interesting thing that this command cites out specifically in the cabinet order is that it can't take direction from the Prime Minister. And the fact that was enunciated so clearly kind of shows that they were worried about the general optics of a government agency and advisors to the Prime Minister, going out and talking about election interference.
It strikes me the other thing, we'll see, but there's been a lot of speculation this can be a close election. So we could see a minority government or some such. So when you get that close, as we saw with the Bush v. Gore race and other races, you often have this, well, if this hadn't happened, it could have been a different result. And so the stakes are very high in a close setting, and I think it's going to be an interesting election in which to watch, unless we get a blowout, in which case people will wonder if it was a manufactured blowout.
I'm curious on election interference, on the role that multi-party systems as well. You talked about Brexit as being an example where these tactics were used. There's two sides of that debate. You're a Remainer, you're part of the Leave campaign. Same thing in the United States, you're a Democrat, you're a Republican. So, unless these foreign actors or these kind of third parties have a particular horse in the game, even if they threw Conservatives under the bus and tried to bring down Andrew Scheer, what kind of role is that going to play in the resurgence of the Greens? If they tried to bring down Trudeau, where are the progressive side of the political spectrum going to park their other vote? So it's probably a little more difficult to kind of predict outcomes. Or drive outcomes.
Any questions in our audience? Back at the mic.
Hi. Yeah, just first of all, great panel. Thank you.
And please introduce yourself.
Rod Elliott, and I am at Global Public Affairs, and great panel. But I guess a comment, at least for me, and I'm a little older, I'm 45, I think of elections as kind of being critical infrastructure to democracy. So, I guess that's more an editorial comment. But my question was actually was at Mike. How much do you think now, like you're covering a whole beat now on misinformation that didn't exist, 5 years ago. I do see when I talk to people, in political circles, they're much more aware of this in terms of how foreign interference could occur or how political parties could use misinformation to their advantage. But so I guess my question is, and then the platforms up in Canada have spent a lot of money cutting checks to organizations that are supportive, like Canadian Journalism Foundation, to educate the public. So how much do you think, things have changed in that the public, the end consumer of the information is getting, is more educated? Or on the flip side, is it causing more challenges because people just don't believe the the media anymore, the trusted media. Seems like you guys have it a lot more politicized down here than we do up in Canada. But I just was curious on your perspective.
Sure. First, so in the U.S., we do consider election infrastructure critical infrastructure. I think Jay Johnson was the one who at DHS who sort of made that call. So as such, I mean, that brings along certain protections and certain oversight. The problem, however, is like unlike Canada, we have a gazillion different election administrations, commissioners who have different policies and practices and equipment and systems in place, and so on like kind of the election hacking front, it's very difficult to have any kind of broad federal oversight of the systems in place, from the actual machines that you vote on to the software for voter rolls and registration. So in just one point on that, which I mean, it's election interference broadly, not disinformation, but we're still trying to figure out just how far the Russians really got in trying to manipulate election systems. In fact, just recently there was news that some counties in Florida were compromised. We only know which one. We only know one of them for sure, which is a fairly small county, but the FBI is not going public with the other one. So I think on that front of things, it's still a bit of a mystery. On the sort of trust in media question, I mean, I think trust in media is rapidly plummeting. I mean, it's already fairly low, I would say. And maybe some stats on that, but I think because we have a president who is outright attacking the press on a daily basis, his entire base is, no matter what we say or do, is going to be perceived as wrong or fake or misinformation or disinformation, whatever you want to call it. So, yeah, I could see a scenario where, there's a candidate that's being, and it's found out that, there's this Russian disinformation campaign on Twitter that was designed to support that candidate. Politico writes about it, and a whole half of the electorate just dismisses that news because it's deemed fake. So I mean, that's a real problem. I think it's a real problem for our entire democracy. I think it's a real problem for the media. I think it's a real problem. It's a real problem for everybody, because we are not trusting the information that we have, and we're only trusting specific segments. I think that is part of Russia's intent, in a way, is to further that distrust among people, among parties, among grassroots organizations. You do see, however, some means to remedy that. I think I mentioned how Google is trying to prioritize legitimate journalism in its search results, but Facebook is also putting a lot of money into trying to develop local news sources and help local news organizations and help them learn how to use the Facebook platform to get good reported local news stories out, because so much of what you see is garbage, right? And how do you surface the legitimate stories is a problem that we're all facing. I mean, when most of the election disinformation I encountered before 2016 were emails that my father sent me, that I had to go onto Snopes and say, no, this is garbage, do not believe this. So I think we're also responsible for spreading so much disinformation, which has always been a part of our political process, right? I think the problem becomes when it's weaponized by a foreign adversary that wants to use it not just to further a candidate, in 2016 case Donald Trump, but then sort of further divide Americans.
I would just add to that. I think, yes, I've definitely seen statistics about trust in media going down. I think it's just internally at Politico, it's something we care about a lot. We do studies of how we are perceived and compared to other media brands. We don't have editorial boards. We don't run opinion. We're very committed to being nonpartisan and neutral, and we see that in the survey results we get in terms of how would you rank this brand. left wing, right wing, neutral. We do get ranked neutral much more so than other news outlets, and it's something that we increasingly have to work very hard to protect. Whether it's what we say on social media, how we cover the news. But we're in a moment right now, and I know this is a little off topic, but we have had to put in a lot of security at our offices. The New York Times bureau downtown here has put in enormous amounts of security. And I say that because my husband works there and I know what they've done, and it's pretty extensive. There has been a newsroom shooting not that long ago. So it's not an abstraction. It's not just a business issue. It's actually something that people have to take incredibly seriously when you're being called the enemy of the people. And some people take that very seriously. So yeah, it's an interesting moment we're living in.
And even before the kind of credibility issue surfaced around the election of Donald Trump, in Canada we've struggled in supporting our news outlets for a long time. And you've seen, I think that's kind of created a vacuum here. And I'm not sure what the American experience is, but created a vacuum in Canada where third party content creators became very powerful, and as they come out with more and more content that is digitally savvy, that is on the smartphones of millennials, on the smartphones of people like my mom, they're getting news in different ways, and I think that it's one of the solutions that I think needs to be brought to any sort of misinformation, disinformation, or election interference campaign is a strong media contingent.
And why were third parties not addressed? Do you think? Why is this?
Well, I think some of them will be called news organizations. Like there's news organizations that spawned out of the Sun news chain that push certain agendas. They're popular in kind of right wing circles, and I think that's kind of filled a vacuum of legitimate journalism.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask one follow-up question on the issue of foreign interference to Mike, which is, I'm very interested in China right now and hosting a podcast at Politico called Global Translations, where we've been looking at the rise of China, the response of America, and how that's impacting the rest of the world. I'm curious, in your field, has there been any evidence to date of China attempting to do anything along the lines of what Russia did in 2016? Are they doing anything offensively, proactively to influence American politics?
So we heard a few years ago that the administration started talking about, it's not just Russia, it's China too, right? And the evidence that really came forward were a few newspaper ads, I think in Iowa, aimed at kind of the agricultural space. So it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility that others, China, Iran, also would take a page from the Russian playbook to create disinformation campaigns to support one policy, one party, one person over another. But you certainly do not see and have not seen what anything like what the GRU pulled off in 2016 and continued to do in 2016 and is expected to do in 2020 from the Chinese. I just don't think it's in the Chinese intelligence services DNA like it is in the Russian DNA, right? We've seen Russians create disinformation campaigns in the early part of the American democratic experience, right? Pulling as soon as there was a free and open press, you saw planting of bogus news stories. In fact, Thomas Rid has done a very good job of sort of charting that and talking about the history of disinformation campaigns. That said, there's a whole other avenue which the Chinese are very good at in terms of disrupting American business, American democracy, stealing information, using it for their benefit. So I would anticipate you wouldn't see sort of that propaganda campaign as much as you would see other sorts of campaign. The Chinese also use cyber attacks to intimidate activists. They track the Uyghur community. They regularly are hacking and surveilling the American Chinese rights groups and things like that. So not like what we saw in 2016 and continue to see with the Russians, but I think they'll use other means, other cyber means.
I think it's just fascinating that we had Russia interfere in a way that was aimed at helping Donald Trump, and the implications that have rolled out from that for China with this whole trade. They're probably sitting there going, why did we let Putin get away with that? It's really cost us a lot of
Time
money.
to pick a horse this year.
Right? Yeah, very interesting. Anyone else? Go ahead. There, and then we'll go to the other side.
I have two questions. We can't see anyone now. A comment and then a longer question.
Great, and introduce yourself so we know.
Justin Margolis for the Quebec office.
Oh, great.
One thing different in Canada is that every year on our tax returns, we update our information with Elections Canada, whereas the U.S. it's at the DMV, which is often every 8 years you have a chance to update your tax return, and or your registration. A tax return is something that every citizen does every single year, which may help to the accuracy of Elections Canada, whereas the DMV, it's every 8 years, and even if you move to a new state, your old registration is not automatically pulled off, which led to the claim of there's people registering in two states. So that's just one comment about a difference in just getting on the electoral rolls. But this is the first year that Canadians abroad will be able to vote without the 5-year residency requirement. And I just have a question on the security of overseas voting. And I'm a dual citizen. I've never voted in person in either country's election, but yet I've never missed an election. I've always voted by mail. And it's quite different the way it's done. In the U.S., your ballot is 6 pages long. It's 3 columns. Recto verso, there's municipal, there's federal, there's judges, there's referendums, there's alcohol permit referendums. Whereas in Canada, we're going to go and we're going to get to vote, and it's going to be for one person, one thing with an X, but the overseas ballots that are sent, because Canada doesn't have to have the candidates in each riding confirmed until halfway through the period, I think it's October 3rd, the ballot we're going to get is going to have nothing on it. If it's the Canadian has to go themselves to elections.ca after October 3rd, find out who all the confirmed people in your riding are. If I want to vote Liberal, if I want to Justin Trudeau, I'd have to write the name of Stephen Guilbeault, who is the candidate for the Liberal Party in Laurier-Sainte-Marie. If I wrote Justin Trudeau, it wouldn't be valid. If I wrote Liberal, it wouldn't be valid. So it's a lot, just because there's not enough logistically time between October 3rd and October 21st to print ballots with names on them and send it out. This is going to be the first time Canadians abroad are voting, some voting for the first time, period, because any Canadian who's ever lived in Canada now can vote in the election. It's going to be most Canadians abroad's first time voting abroad. I don't think Elections Canada has done that much education about how to vote from abroad. On the other side, for the security side, to get on the International Registry of Elections for Elections Canada, I had to submit my passport, my proof of address in Quebec, and then also my proof of address here in the U.S. I can never change my home riding. It'll always be the same. If I want to change the address where the ballot is mailed to, I have to submit new proof to Elections Canada, and it's federally administered. Whereas in Ohio, all I did was give them the last 4 digits of my social, and I had a ballot mailed to any address in the world I wanted, even the Quebec office in Brussels, Belgium. And yet if I showed up in person, I don't have the right ID to vote. So, because of the new voter ID laws, just the question is, are these ballots by mail going to cause confusion when Canadians abroad get a piece of paper with no names on it, and they're told go online, find out who your candidate is, and what's the security on the American side of being able to just give any address in the world you want, but yet showing up in person with your passport and social, you don't have the right ID to vote because it's not a state ID. So it's a rant, but it's a pertinent question.
Anyone want to take that on?
I'm happy to answer.
Oh, okay.
Not from Elections Canada, are you?
No.
Hi, I'm Paul Cadario. Hi, Chris. The University of Toronto, but I live here. I have voted for as an international elector for years and years. It's not really hard to go online and find out who to vote for and write their name on the list. What is hard to make sure it arrives in Ottawa by 5 o'clock on election day, which, depending on how the mail works, is tricky. I registered, because I was on the old electoral system, the old international electoral system, which got purged with the Elections Act. I had to apply again, and 48 hours later, Elections Canada sent me an email saying, you know, you're registered, please be sure there's an election. And then they did it again, and the next, and again, and so I'm worried Am I on there 3 times or once? Nonetheless, it's not a big deal if you want to vote. I'm not going to comment on the American system. I have a question, though, about the disinformation issue. And the comment about China actually gave me a little sub-question. There has been remarkably irresponsible reporting of the SNC-Lavalin matter, particularly by some columnists at a newspaper that broke the story. And I think it would be easy to be misled by things that have actually appeared in Canadian newspapers. What would the critical incidents protocol require be done if bots by a foreign actor were to start amplifying some of this old news, some of which has been debunked, some of which has not been properly addressed? And what sort of a problem, and Chris may have thought about this, would that create for the credibility of both the protocol, which I think is very sound, but also for the efforts by Elections Canada to make sure Canadians are offered accurate information or not overwhelmed by targeted misinformation. Or
So you're setting up a scenario where the scandal that's involved the prime minister,
Right.
someone wrote about it in one of the national newspapers, perhaps.
over and over again.
Okay. And now a foreign entity is amplifying
Right.
that.
But a subset of that is with China, is the system, the elections, the system that's been put in place, able to deal with Chinese disinformation that would be, say, targeted toward the suburbs of Toronto or the suburbs of Vancouver in order to influence the election? Now, I'm not sure there'd be a big change in Canadian foreign policy, whoever wins, Canadian foreign policy about China. But nonetheless, is there the capacity to deal with what might be an attack surface in terms of, okay, would we know what's going on? Would we understand that it's disinformation? Would we be able to figure out whose bots these are or where the disinformation is coming from?
I'll take the first part of that.
I was actually, before you jump into that, just to address I think part of the previous question was about the security of voting by mail, right? Which I think in this country at least is perceived to be one of the more secure ways to vote. Because, you're not using a computer, you're not, the postal service is hard to hack, right? Once the mail's in there, it gets arrived. Eventually. The other problem, like the logistics are another problem, but the actual security of being compromised is fairly safe. In the U.S., there's been some experimentation with voting, expat voters using mobile apps to vote, which has been widely condemned by the security community as being ripe for, tampering with. So I just wanted to make that point.
One of the things that I believe is in the bill as well is any person that sponsors tweets or sponsors or has ad campaigns, they actually have to have a Canadian bank account. So that would kind of fall under FinTrack, which is kind of their financial investigative body of the federal government. So they would know what bank account it came from, where the money was wired. It's not as if you can set up a Venmo or a PayPal account.
So I feel like I'm going to make matters worse because you know that old joke about the babysitter who there's a scary person. I'm getting all these calls and they call and the police say, yes, they're coming from within the house. And you realize, because I think foreign influence in Canadian elections might be most likely to come from the United States. And I don't mean that it would be a Trumpian campaign, but one of the things that has happened already in this campaign, even though no political party, as far as I know, has a platform in Canada about eliminating abortion or abortion access, there are many groups here who are quite hot on that subject. Now, what happens if a Canadian reads an American ad saying abortion is bad and Trudeau's talked about the Conservatives taking it away, and you get that kind of influence? The Harper government was quite worried about environmental groups that were sending money north of the border to try to stir up opposition to oil pipelines. So not an organized government effort, but what if American debates crossed the permeable border? And the actual information may be information or disinformation, but it occurs outside Canada. It's not part of a campaign. How do we deal with that? For example, let's say there's a story, and you were talking about SNC Lavalin, but let's say there was a story that Wall Street is concerned there's going to be a recession next week. And you think, oh, do I want to elect the Trudeau people because they're going with higher taxes and bigger deficits? Maybe we'd be safer with the Conservatives. So it can even be those kinds of things. So that would be my first concern, is I'm a little worried about that. Secondly, we've seen in the United States polling that everybody has the Nielsen or Gallup is calling everybody on the phone, and we used to talk about, well, are they going to get people on their cell phones? But a lot of political forecasting is based on social media data mining, looking at what you look at, where, trying to estimate where support is and so on, and guide political parties on that indirect basis. So if you have false information in there, it may not be about influencing voters, it may be influencing perceptions of voters. And all you need is an election that is wildly out of line with what the polls all said was going to happen, which was sort of the Trump problem. And you automatically create suspicion and delegitimacy in some people's minds for the outcome of the election. So putting all of those things together, I think there's a lot of vulnerability we haven't quite tacked onto. And there's one more that I'm going to add, which is not going to make anybody happy. And that's we sometimes pretend the internet is all in English. And yet, in various communities, they're participating in an internet which is not in English. And so what I worry about for the people who have to do the critical election incident public protocol is, what if, to use the example that Paul raised, what if the attempt is to influence Cantonese speakers in Vancouver and Toronto? They're absorbing this in Cantonese, not even Mandarin. It may have originated in China, and will these guys even know anywhere near in a timely fashion to alert people? And if they did, would those voters necessarily be responsive, because they may not be paying attention? So this is not a criticism of what Canada's trying to do, only to suggest that it's a start, but we're going to have a lot more work to do. And I think focusing on Russia and China in Canada's case is probably missing the elephant south of the border, which is us.
Whoops. Any other questions? Just someone who hasn't spoke over here.
Hi, I'm Jim Dickmeyer. I'm with the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center right now. I'd like to step back and see what we're talking about in a kind of historical perspective and where we're at in its cycle. We had radio as a new technology that came in, and people could use that. We saw that certainly in pre-World War II, where the Axis was trying to keep the U.S. out of the war, and the Allies, the British, were using radio and so on to bring us in. TV certainly had its impact on how the American public saw Vietnam War and so on. Where are we in this technology and that kind of cycle? Because we've survived kind of those effects of technology on democratic norms in their time. Are we going to kind of survive this, or is it distinctly different?
What do you think, Mike?
Well, I would say we're in the infancy, right? We're just trying to figure out how to live with technology, and that spans all parts of society, right? It spans how I deal with my 14-year-old's Instagram account to how we deal with information coming at us at, faster than we can even think about all sorts of opinions and where it's coming from, and figuring out how we trust that, and and to transactional relationships online and building in trust while maintaining privacy. So we're still trying to figure out how to walk with technology. And I think I'm an optimist, so I think we'll survive. I think there are tremendous good things that the technology that we all use today can be deployed to make things better and safer and make our democracies stronger. But I do also think it's going to get worse before it gets better, right? Because what we're seeing here is everyone trying to play catch up, and Washington is 5 to 10 years behind what's happening in Silicon Valley and figuring out the implications for technology. We're on the verge of another sort of technological revolution with artificial intelligence, and what that's going to do for information and our democracy and our workforce it's already beginning to happen. We haven't even really talked about that in a substantial way in Washington yet. So
We have an AI summit tomorrow.
this
at
is
Politico.
a plug to
All day.
segue that, so if you want to figure that out. So I think, yeah, I think we'll survive, and we're just figuring out the blips, and we'll make it work. I think that, with print, we're still dealing with the disinformation in print and still trying to get our media right. But hopefully we'll figure out these tough questions as well. I don't know, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, like, you think about the short period of time that these digital platforms and social platforms have been offered, they've done some pretty incredible things. And I think, we still have massive communication walls erected in places like China. Think about the possibilities of these networks in countries like that. So I think, we focus on kind of the defensive side, on the negative things that these tools can be used for, but they can be an agent of good. And I think at the end of the day, we've been focused for the last 3 years, since the last presidential election, on kind of what happened, and we kind of approach these stakeholders in a very defensive way. They need to be part of the solution at the end of the day. And I think that the technology that they have, the experience they have, is can be a mark for good, but it needs to engage with government in order to find those solutions.
Interesting. I had an interesting conversation with Michael Adams. Some of you will know the Canadian pollster, wrote a couple books, Sex in the Snow, about Canadians, and Fire and Ice about Canada's comparison.
Very Canadian.
And we had a chance to meet.
Sounds like an HBO show.
It does, yeah. But he said, we had just talked briefly, and he said, so I want to understand kind of where you're coming from this, an American who's interested in Canada. And I said, well, I don't know, Michael. I could tell you that I'm a middle-aged white guy who goes to church on Sunday and lives in the suburbs and drives a sedan. And because he's a pollster, he's like, okay, I have your profile. And I worry a little bit that AI, artificial intelligence, will have a similarly deterministic, reductionist effect, that what in the early days won't be very sophisticated, but will actually just try to reduce voters down to these 3 things are the most likely to shift voter behavior, but miss some of the complexity we know is out there from our political science research in voter decision formation. So I am a little worried about AI, not in the conventional way of Skynet, but just because I wonder if this powerful tool, in order to be effective, will have to be a bit of a blunt instrument. Maybe over time it gets better. The other thing, kind of picking up on something some of the other folks have said, I worry about timing. Everything's so much faster in this world of the internet. And we used to talk about the October surprise, the big piece of news that could shift an American election in November that comes out in October, and there's just not enough time to change people's minds. I think in Canada, you could have an October 20th surprise, and except for the mail-in voters, where there's really not enough time to correct the record. It's all going to happen sort of virally in real time. And it's one thing if you have something that's clearly political speech that's triggering that, maybe an ad. But what if it's an Instagram photo of somebody who was killed with a handgun, or that's the claim, and it's just the photo, and there's really not a lot of verbal content, and it starts going, and people are like, yeah, we need more gun control laws, and that becomes the issue. So I think that there's a lot of gray, and Paul's right. With bot amplification, you can take that gray, you can very much put it in people's minds and create the kind of doubts that's going to make elections much more complicated for people, I suspect.
I mean, these things have happened in the past, even before kind of the digital wave. I remember the 2011 election, sitting in a bar in downtown Ottawa, and finding out that Osama bin Laden had been captured and killed. And the first thing that I thought was, hey, this is great, this is justice. But 2 was, how is this going to affect the election? There's clearly one kind of hawkish foreign policy mind at the table, and that was Stephen Harper, and there was one dove in the NDP. So I think these October surprises, or these kind of last minute stories, will transcend even whatever comes next after social media.
Well, I think we're getting down on our time. I want to just talk through what I think our takeaways would be today. Clearly, this new policy that Canada has brought in is, as far as these things go, robust, more robust than what other countries have done. It is possible, I think, in part because of a national elections administration and because of a centralized form of government that is able to do sort of a whole of government approach to these things. I think on the flip side, we've heard a lot this morning that would suggest that it can only go so far. This makes this election very interesting to see, as you put it, how it will be road tested, whether it falls into some kind of politicization trap or not. The role of nonpartisan public servants will be very interesting to watch to see if they actually do pull the alarm on anything, and if so, how that plays out. I think it'll be interesting to watch in the coming year whether the U.S. takes any steps and the kinds of pressures that are being put to bear on the platforms. So thank you all for helping illuminate this interesting issue at a timely moment. I will put in a plug that today we are launching our Canada election coverage on Politico.com, so please check it out. We're doing a big polling page and a lot of coverage for the next few weeks. And Chris and I will be co-hosting with Scotty Greenwood a Canadian Election Night Watch Party here in DC. You're all welcome. So stick with us. We're going to be watching this election really closely. And thank you all.
Can I put in one last word just from my side? I think that one of the challenges of every kind of policy now is that we're all quite ideological, or we have our biases and so on. And there's something to be said for the way Canada does things, trying as best it can to manage an evidence-based policy, formulation process. And for the United States, as contentious as anything to do with election administration reform is going to be, Canada may not have solved all the problems, but I think Canada is going to give us some useful data in an environment which might not be quite as hot as our own experience. And I think the value of you all coming, and really appreciate everybody who's been here, is that what we can learn from Canada might help us. This isn't the answer, but it might help us get to the answer a few iterations down the road. So good on Canada.
Well, we're all in it together, right? All right, thank you all.
Justin, how are you?